Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 25th of March meeting of Ealing's Overview and Scrutiny Committee. We meet tonight as the Crime and Disorder Committee. It's one of our statutory functions to look at crime and disorder every year. And this evening we're joined by Ben Moore, Borough Commander for Ealing from London Fire Brigade, and Chief Superintendent Peter Gardner, the West Area BCU Commander from the Met, to help in our questioning. We've got officers as well from Safer Communities team, and generally we'll be looking at the annual report of the work of the Safer Ealing Partnership. And for those of you with long memories, this is the meeting that we cancelled last year because it was the first meeting we had scheduled after lockdown. So I'm pleased that we're making it, but slightly sad that we're still not making it quite in person. But thank you everyone for giving up your evenings and being here at least virtually. I haven't had any apologies for absence or substitutions. We don't have any minutes because this is our kind of annual separate meeting. Are there any declarations of interest? No one wants to own up to committing crimes? No? Good. There are no matters to be considered in private. And there are no urgent matters, which takes us on to our one and only item this evening, the annual report of the work of the Safer Ealing Partnership. And I've got Jess Murray and Paul Murphy to introduce the report, and then we'll move to Peter Gardner and then to Ben Moore to take us through the work of the police and the fire brigade. Paul and Jess.
Thanks very much, Chair. I think what I'll do is I think Jess and I spoke briefly about this, and I'll just do a very quick scan through of the report this year, what it includes, and then if Jess, you want to jump in with anything that you wanted to add to that. I mean, obviously, as you alluded to, Chair, it's been a very unusual year. Last year, I think we met as a first time, almost a bit of a trial of a virtual scrutiny, even though it wasn't actually a formal scrutiny last year. And here we are a year later, still in a form of lockdown that we were in last time. The report this year, though, has followed a very similar style to previous, and sort of it's really a development on the format we've developed over the last few years. As always, there's been a significant contribution from a very wide range of services, both within and outside of the council, and from Blue Light Partners in particular. Obviously, we've got Ben Moore, London Fire Brigade Borough Commander, with us this evening, and Peter Gardner, Chief Superintendent Peter Gardner from the MPS, who have, along with their colleagues, pulled together their specific contributions. But there's been a whole range of other partners who've contributed, and hopefully I've managed to cover most of those people off in the cover report. But there were a lot of people involved in pulling this report together. It obviously provides, as you say, an overview of the work of the Safer Ealing Partnership, and specifically the 3-year strategy developed in 2020 with a focus on tackling drug abuse and alcohol abuse, preventing exploitation and victimisation, effective management of spaces, and strengthened information sharing. And the chapters of this report all link back fairly consistently to those key areas. In particular, the report outlines some of the developments around protecting vulnerable people. That's specifically tackling child criminal exploitation and child sexual exploitation, some of the work that's gone into disrupting county lines networks, better integrated offender management, as well as the development of initiatives like the Spaces Panel, which uses a data-led approach to identify specific spaces in the borough that have been disproportionately affected by crime, and tries to look at what creative long-term changes we might be able to make to those spaces to change behaviours and enhance the spaces for everybody. A lot of that all comes back to improved information sharing across the partnership, and there's quite a focus on that throughout the report. But it does also outline where much of the partnership focus has been during 2020. And COVID aside, some key areas of focus during 2020 have been knife crime and violence affecting young people, increasing awareness, reporting, detection and sanctions of hate crime, domestic abuse and the impact of COVID on domestic abuse, particularly how we build that into our COVID recovery, area-based initiatives to reduce crime in ASB, modern-day slavery and the exploitation of vulnerable adults, and male violence against women and girls. Most of the sections in this report do include a summary on how different partners are building those areas of focus into their priorities for next year as well, so for 2021-22. The first bit of the report takes us to police, which I know Mr. Gardner will go through, the specific 5 areas as well of West Area area, BCU being HQ response, public protection, local investigations, and neighbourhoods in partnerships. Then the 5 brigades, Ben Moore will come in. I know he'll be comparing performance around specific incident types and some of the wider prevention and safeguarding work LFB do in his section. I know that last year there was a specific interest raised in relation to hate crime, and we've got a specific chapter this year which outlines not just the key data on hate crime, but also a lot of the local work being done to raise awareness and reporting. We've got a full section on domestic abuse with a subsection specifically around male violence against women and girls as well, but also looking at the impacts of COVID, because I know that was an area of very high concern nationally, but also locally. Then we come into some of the key council service areas and some of the council partnership forums as well. So obviously the Safe Communities team, the Noise and Nuisance team, CCTV, the patrol services, so that includes Park Guard and the police proactive patrol team, as well as crime prevention and alligating, the Community Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference, the MARAC, and Prevent. And then the report takes us on to those wider service areas. So regulatory services, which includes licensing, trading standards, workplace safety, food safety, the drug and alcohol intervention and treatment teams, including the Women's Wellness Zone. And then there's a section on the work of integrated youth services and the ongoing development of contextual safeguarding in Ealing as well. There's also a few pieces within there around some of the voluntary groups that we work with, and in particular Ealing Mediation Service, who obviously continue to support us a great deal around dispute resolution. It's been a very challenging year for them as well. Obviously, it goes without saying, an enormous focus throughout the report is on the individual services and the partnership as a whole's response to COVID. And there's a lot of detail about the work being done, particularly around that was done during summer of last year around protecting parks and open spaces, keeping them open and keeping them safe, but also in the regulatory services aspect in particular, and touched upon in some of the police work, is tackling non-compliant businesses and protecting town centres. So you've got a slide pack included in your report, which contains most, if not all, I think, of the slides that I've got to share on this evening. It's not really a presentation, but I do have, I can do a screen share at various points as and when it might be helpful. So there's a particular graph or data set we want to examine more closely, I've got that. But that is basically the report in a nutshell, I suppose. Might have been a bit of a rambling nutshell, so apologies. Jess, did you want to add anything to what I've said?
Thanks, Paul. So very comprehensive, obviously, Paul. He summarised that very well. I suppose from my perspective, the key point I wanted to draw out is the fact that it's been a bit of a year like no other, as we all know. And it has been a real challenge for all services that sit underneath the scope of the SEP to respond to that, both in terms of their business as usual, as well as all the new challenges that have been faced with us. I know we've had whole new sets of legislation being kind of thrown our way with a very short amount of notice, and that changing regularly, and trying to support people to understand new rules, new regulations, and then work through with other partners how we implement those and support those has been a real challenge. But I suppose for me, what it's really demonstrated, and I hope this comes through tonight in the conversation, the dialogue and the report that Paul's prepared for you guys, is the strength of the partnership has really stood us in good stead, and having that ability to really have honest conversations with partners across various different services to try and make sure that we're supporting each other and getting the best outcome for the residents of Ealing has, I think, shone through and has been quite reassuring. So for me, that's been hopefully the underlying message that comes through tonight, because that's certainly been my experience trying to support the team and manage through all the various different things that have come our way. So that's pretty much my contribution at this point. So I hand back to you, Chair.
Great, thank you. It is always a comprehensive report, and it's always very well put together. But I think it is even more impressive this year, given the challenges that we've faced, to have got this much in the report, and the having done the work in the first place to be able to report on is very impressive. So we'll move then to Chief Superintendent Peter Gardner. And Peter, if you want to talk us through the work of the BCU, and then we can take questions on your work and the work of your colleagues in the Met.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me clearly?
Yeah. Okay.
So thank you. Firstly, I apologise that I'm not on camera. Unfortunately, Zoom is blocked from my system, so I wasn't able to. So I'm having to participate over the phone. As was mentioned earlier, the last 12 months has obviously been completely dominated by COVID, as well as a number of high-profile events for policing, not least of which was Black Lives Matter in the summer. West Area BCU, which I'm responsible for, which includes the Borough of Ealing, also includes the boroughs of Hillingdon and Hounslow. As mentioned, we had 5 strands. Leadership of those strands is now well established. We lost two of our superintendents last year and have had temporary superintendents in place for a couple of months, but we have our permanent team in place now. So Superintendent Anthony Bennett runs the headquarters, which is all the support functionality, criminal justice functionality. Our public protection team is led by Detective Superintendent Karen Brooks. Response is led by Superintendent James Pigg. Neighbourhoods and Partnerships is led by Superintendent Bill Horsfall. And CID, or investigation, is led by Duncan Slade, who is also acting as my de facto deputy at the moment. Comparative performance, it's always hard to compare year on year when we've had a year like this, which has been different to any other. So I also look very much at performance relative to peers, which is kind of borne out, I think, in the slide in the document, which is figure 3, which shows our sort of offences by 1,000 population. So whilst overall crime has reduced considerably by 8%, there are pockets where crime has increased. Some of those were expected. Some of those are less expected. The biggest, I think our biggest success really has been reduction in youth violence over the last 12 months. So this has been the number one focus of myself and my team. We've reduced that by 40% over the last 12 months, which is in excess of all the other BCUs. Apart from Westminster, which has obviously benefited from the closure of Soho in terms of reduction of youth violence. So that's we measure youth violence by knife injury victims under 25, excluding domestic abuse, and on that measure we're down 40%. So whilst violence overall, if we look at the picture, is up just under 3% across Ealing, we look at that reduction in violence with injury overall, which is down 8%. And then we look at, within that, our core youth violence demographic, which is down nearly 40%. The other areas where we have seen rises have been particularly around domestic abuse, and there's a section on domestic abuse. That was an expected rise in violence, and we will talk to that in due course. But we've also seen a significant increase in antisocial behaviour, primarily through the reporting of COVID breaches, etc. The robbery, burglary, and most of our core crimes are down significantly also. What I am really comfortable with is also that our sanction detection rates, which is the amount of crimes that we're actually detecting and locking people up for, has increased considerably across all of those areas also. Our robbery detection rate, we've more than doubled. Our domestic abuse detection rate is basically flat, but it remains the second highest in the Met, just over 17%. Our hate crime detection rate, whilst we are short of the Met target of 15%, we have consistently been above that for the last 3 months. And in addition, we have doubled the domestic abuse detection rate virtually since it was 7.6% last year, and we're now consistently over 15%. So within those pockets, a lot of really good hard work is going on across the officers. I'll just put some of the work that's gone down into the different teams that is included in the report, just so you have an overall picture of what's going on. I'll start with our response teams. Our response teams are our busiest police officers in the Met. Across West area, we have more calls to service than any other area in the Met. Our drivers on average drive 500,000 miles more per annum than anywhere else in the Met. And in addition to those calls to service, we deal with more open crime than any other area in the Met. That core initial response is led by our response teams. We have 3 response teams across the BCU. The Ealing response team is based out of Ealing Police Station, just across the road from the council offices. The response team we've enhanced this year. We've put significant investment into it. We have gone from a period where we were carrying about 10% vacancies last year to being overstrength at the moment in response. We've also established a separate team within response, an investigations team, to assist with the investigations of what we call tip level 1 crimes. So these are our non-violent crimes, our lower level crimes, our non-violent burglaries, our shopliftings, our theft from motor vehicles, etc. Drive a significant increase in detections across that area. So that's been a big investment. We have, by the end of next year, 90 officers in that team supporting our separate response team, making sure that we can, drive a significant increase in confidence and satisfaction, which we're starting to see across the DCU. I grades and S grades, these are our performance measures. I grade is when we generally need to get to a call within 15 minutes. S grades is an hour. I'll be perfectly frank with you with S grades. I tell my officers they are not a priority because, in a world of finite resources, I'd much rather they're focusing on the higher risk area. So we hit about 80% of our I grades and about 64% of our S grades, which is relatively consistent across the net. The bulk of our stop and search is also done by our response officers. We've managed to maintain a consistent rate of about virtually a quarter of our stop and searches result in either an arrest or a sanction or a fine of some sort, i.e. weapons, drugs, etc. We are investing significantly in cervical training around our stop and search. This is training to allow our officers to better distinguish those people that are more likely to be displaying behaviour that would give rise to a stop and search. This is the same training that our counter-terrorism officers get, and the idea is this should reduce the number of searches that we're doing unnecessarily, so it will allow us to focus really on the people we should be searching. It's quite a significant investment. We've been supported by the City of London Police, who's the national lead in that, and they're doing it as initially locally on Ealing before rolling it out to the rest of the Met. Our patrol officers also provide the bulk of our level 2 contingent that does our public order policing, so heavily involved in policing of Brexit. I was Brexit commander for a long period of last year, and heavily involved also in the policing of protest activity following the tragic murder of George Floyd in the US and the resulting Black Lives Matter protest activity across London. Our neighbourhood team is the core of our community policing. This year we've invested heavily in them. We've created a neighbourhood tasking team led by an inspector and then 3 separate teams of 1 sergeant and 13 officers, one of which is based in Ealing, though the teams flex across all of the boroughs. We've got a significantly good relationship with the borough in terms of joint enforcement. We've conducted a number of licensing reviews, 3 venues of which have been subject to those based on COVID breaches. We've also undertaken, I think, at least 22 closure orders and lead in terms of CBOs. There's been some excellent joint working with the local authority around COVID compliance. Particularly, we saw this in the summer when we had significant numbers of unlicensed music events taking place when the COVID crisis was right at its peak, and really good working with our jointly tasked town centre funded teams. In the coming year, we are investing more in our town centre teams. That should take place over the next 12 months. I don't have exact dates for it yet. We're also launching Operation Palladium in the neighbourhood teams at the start of the summer. This is going to be, rather than just our revolving DWOs, etc. in the ward, we're going to put additional officers into our high crime areas on static posts, so the Southall Broadway, Ealing Broadway, etc. Some of our more vulnerable areas will have neighbourhood officers there on static posts throughout the day, so there will always be a visible policing presence in those higher risk areas. We'll also be looking at enhancing some of our wards in due course as part of the uplift and creating more safe spaces with designing out crime teams within those wards. Public protection is the area where we have seen the increase, and it is an area where, if I'm honest, I do have a number of concerns still about our performance. We have the highest rate of domestic abuse in London across West area, and within that, Ealing has the highest rate across the 3 boroughs. we've got a really good detective superintendent now, Sharon Brooks. She's come from a long and extensive background in CATE investigations, which is our serious sexual abuse investigations. So I'm very pleased to have her and the leadership team on board. Over the last 12 months, we've invested heavily, the start in October 19, in our teams that investigate online child sexual abuse activity. We also set up a predatory offender unit within the team in November last year. So this is really focusing on those individuals that pose a predatory risk to women and girls and vulnerable young people. Since establishing that team at the end of last year, we've already made 78 arrests and undertaken a number of warrants. Significant volume of missing persons we still deal with, and mental health. We have a very good team embedded at St. Barney's around mental health, but it still is a significant factor for us. So 11% of the calls that we take across the net relate to people within a mental health crisis. Some people argue that it's not the police's business to be dealing with mental health, but ultimately we are the line of last defense, and if somebody is displaying behavior in a mental health crisis which poses a risk to themselves or others, it's only right that we attend. So we do have some challenges there. We do have, obviously, we've got excellent work with the NASH, and we'll go into, domestic abuse later. The challenge with our NASH really has been the volume, over 1,000 notifications per month, and also with the MARAC, we've our multi-agency risk assessment conferences. We've seen a 27% increase in cases across the board there. I'm working with Sharon at the moment to put a rape investigations improvement plan in place. We're working with the central team around us, how we improve. We're not out of line with anywhere else in the Met. This is an organizational challenge for all of us. The sanction detection rate since R.V. Allen has dropped significantly since new disclosure rules came in. And for me, that's just not right. We need to give much better support to our victims and much better outcomes. So we'll have a significant investment in rape and rape detection over the next 12 months in terms of reorganizing the way we do that and looking how to drive better outcomes for our victims. The other key areas I just want to highlight are obviously within CID. We've done significant work across the borough itself. We have had two significant challenges from a gangs perspective over the last 12 months. I say gangs, I use that term obviously as quite a divisive term. I'd say organized groups or organized groups of criminal activity. In particular, we had a lot of activity in the South Acton area where really we were in the business of trying to prevent homicides from taking place. It was an extremely volatile situation. We had support from a number of central assets for an extended period of time and dismantled one of the larger organized crime groups in that area, reducing risk significantly across South Acton. We've also had significant risk more recently across the Norfolk area coming into the north of the borough from the N gang, which seems to be in conflict with almost every other gang in London at the moment. So we have significant investigative activity and, activity which is not in the public view taking place in those areas, as well as significant uniform presence in those areas to prevent further violence. And that's borne out by the reduction that we've seen in serious youth violence. We have a significant investment coming in this currently in the year ahead. We've talked about the investment in neighborhoods. We've talked about the investment in response teams. We're putting more officers into our predatory offenders unit. We're increasing our training for officers, particularly in our safeguarding area. We are creating additional teams there also for historic sexual abuse investigations. We've invested significantly and are nearing the complete refurbishment of Acton Police Station from top to bottom. So it's been a significant investment in the last 12 months into policing in Ealing. Looking ahead, we are coming into what I believe could be a very tough period for policing over the next, certainly over the next 6 months. We've seen the frustrations of lockdown. We've seen that borne out in Bristol. We know that from Monday, restrictions start to be lifted. It could be quite a volatile summer with people having been locked up for a year coming out, wanting to celebrate. And, we want to help them do that, but we want to help them do that in a safe and responsible manner. So we do have our challenges ahead of us. It is going to be a busy year, and I think it's going to be a year where the relationship, the partnership that we work between us is going to be really come to the fore in terms of the benefits for us. That's sort of a brief overview of our activity and what we're doing over the last 12 months and results, and also the investment going forward. I'd be happy to take any questions that anybody would like to pose, please.
Brilliant. Thank you, Peter. I've got Councillor Crawford first, and then a couple of other hands up as well. So if Dan, you want to go first, and then I've got Councillors Shaw, Wright, and Ball. Councillor Ball's found the hands up button. Good. So if we take Dan and then Gareth, and then we'll do Miriam and John. So Dan, then Gareth, and Peter to respond.
Thank you, Chair. I have three brief questions, if I may. The first is around the performance of officers. I have to say, as a councillor for Acton Central, I've always found the Acton Central Safer Neighbourhoods team to be fantastic. They're very diligent, very responsive. Local residents know all about them, how to contact them, and it's a shining example of the neighbourhood policing model. So I'd like to congratulate them on that. And you mentioned, Peter, in your presentation about the successes with regards to police licensing. I'd also echo that in terms of the work that the licensing team does across the borough, the police licensing team, in terms of, reviewing premises, making sure they're compliant, and where they're not compliant, getting good results at the licensing subcommittee. So I'd just like to pass on my thanks to those two branches of your officers for all their hard work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Long may it continue. The two substantive questions I have, the first one is a little bit left field, so forgive me. The BCU model has bedded in now. It's still relatively new to us as elected representatives, certainly to local to the local population. I wonder if you could speak about a little bit more about how your experience is with that, how you think it's progressing, and what the benefits are, perhaps in terms of sharing intelligence a bit more broadly with local colleagues.
Absolutely. So I've had significant experience with the BCUs. I was the HQ superintendent at the very first BCU, the Pathfinder, which was the Camden and Islington merger. I then also managed and implemented the most complex BCU, which was Southwest, which was the only 4-borough BCU before coming to West area. So I've had a lot of experience of it. There are huge benefits to it. There are challenges also, and it has been an evolution, and some of the things that we thought would work haven't worked as well as they are. But the overall challenge we had when we were looking at going into BCU models is that it was unsustainable to maintain policing on 32 different bases across London. Some of the borough teams were too small to continue to be an effective police unit on their own. I mean, we were talking about some borough response teams, and not Ealing, of course, putting out literally 8 or 12 officers at night, which means that any time anything happened, they had to leverage across the Met. In particular, also, we suffered from a significant shortage of detective capability. At the time, we're 800 detectives short. So we didn't have the capacity or capability to run separate investigative teams across all the boroughs. Also, crime is evolving. Our criminals certainly don't respect borough boundaries, and neither should we really. It should be the closest unit to attend. So the benefits really was firstly significantly in terms of scale, being able to leverage resources across the areas into where they were most needed. That means if we had a significant incident in Ealing, it's much easier for me to get resources from across the whole of West London to attend that incident rather than rely on going through a lumpier chain of command to get central resources allocated to us. There's significant benefit from that. From an investigative capacity, so when I think particularly of our public protection team and our PID team, we certainly would not be able to do the job we're doing without having merged the DCUs. Simply the scale of the complexities of crimes that we were facing were too small, too complex, and of too high a volume to be investigated individually by small local CID teams or safeguarding teams as they were back then before we changed public protection. So those economies of scale and the benefit of that are significant. From a command and control perspective, we've had significant benefits also. We've slimmed down our command structure. It's much more responsive. It's much more nimble in terms of decision making and effectiveness. But there are some things we've changed. I think some of the neighborhood work we didn't, when we started, we didn't have the neighborhood pastoring teams that we have now. We didn't have the investigations teams that support our response teams, which we have now. So certainly, as we've gone through the BC model, where it worked, we've done more of it. Where we found difficulties, we've worked to fix them. So I think overall, it's embedded now. It is the way things are. For me, it makes sense. I can't think of going back to the old way of policing. And for my officers, it makes an awful lot of sense also.
Thank you. I'll just have one more, if that's okay, Chair.
Yeah, you did say there were two.
Thank you. It's a question about representation, and I don't know, Peter, what you can say, and I don't want to lead you towards trouble here, but there is a perception amongst certain parts of the public that the Met Police still doesn't look like modern London, and we still struggle sometimes to speak to particular communities whose support we need to cut crime and increase safety. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about how you feel that work is going in terms of both our approach to our very diverse community and encouraging both people who would like careers in the police force to apply and the people who do have careers in the police force from diverse backgrounds that they will be promoted on merit, and they will have the opportunity to progress as high as they want to.
Yes, certainly. I think I don't disagree. If I'm honest, the police force does not look like at the moment the community that the police is, and we know that. London, 40% of Londoners come from an ethnic minority background. Within the police, it's significantly lower than that. West area is one of the most diverse DCUs in London. We have 23.5% of our officers are from an ethnic minority background, which is more than most. But it's still short of the 40% that we know makes up Londoners across the board. So I certainly don't disagree with your comment, and I think it's a challenge for us, and it's a challenge for us as leaders to make sure that we do have a force that every part of society trusts and feels that represents them. We've got good success in the West area of promoting people from ethnic minority backgrounds into positions of rank. So we have a high proportion of officers in leadership positions in West area from ethnic minority backgrounds and other areas. We're investing heavily at the moment, obviously, with the uplift in recruitment and making it easier for prospective officers from ethnic minority background to come into the police. So last year, when I looked at police officer applications across West London for the borough of Ealing, more than 50% of those applying to be a police officer were from an ethnic minority background. So we've set up an initiative locally, which we're also running, where we're going to partner up all those officers with an established police officer who's effectively going to act as a police friend and help them through the recruitment process, give them support and advice, because it is a long process. It takes a year, give or take, but give them support and advice and help them get through that process. So it is a challenge for us, no doubt. It's one that we are improving Are we improving fast enough? I don't think so. I think, that's why we have the challenge of the mayor's plan, and that's why we're doing the things that we're doing at the moment. So, for me, it's as much about representation as it is about how we treat people fairly and consistently and drive that confidence. So what I often look at is the confidence gap, that is the confidence and satisfaction between victims of crime who are from a white background and victims of crime who are from an ethnic minority background. And in Ealing, it's one of the narrowest in the net. And I think that is borne out by the higher percentage of ethnic minority officers we have in Ealing, and also the fact that my officers, bar none, are expected to treat everybody, consistently, regardless of their background. And so it's something that is a challenge for us, but it's something that is, Chris has spoken publicly about this, the Commissioner. It is one that is, it's up there in terms of her top two priorities. One is ensuring that we have the confidence of all communities across London, and the other is bearing down on violent crime. So it's a challenge, but it's one that I think we're rising to, and I'm hoping we can accelerate our progress in.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Councillor Shaw. And then I've got Councillors Rice, Ball, Cotton and Burke waiting. So if we can keep the questions succinct.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I'll do my best, and thank you for that, brief overview of the statistics, in which, of course, I know there is so much, and similarly to Councillor Crawford, I think everybody does appreciate the hard work that's all involved in the Met do for us on behalf of us over the course of the year.
Thank you.
I would just like to sort of have a look at some of the response times, and very broadly speaking, I see that the response times have remained similar over the last over the previous year compared to this year. Sort of 80.5% grade I compared to 79.8% grade I, and about a percentage difference in grade S as well. And I was wondering if there's much difference, or there isn't much difference, but how that is reflected over the course of the lockdown period. I mean, obviously at times there was less traffic on the roads, at other times there was more traffic on the roads. But then perhaps more specifically, one of the big issues, particularly in my ward in Walpole and around the West Ealing area, are low traffic neighbourhoods, which I'm sure you'll be aware of. I have a number of residents, a very large number of residents emailing me on a regular basis. They are saying that actually, they feel unsafe. Of course, I recognise that there are differences in perceptions of crime and actual crime happening. But nevertheless, they're saying that they feel unsafe, which is a concern in itself, and that they're worried that the police or any emergency services are being impacted by the low traffic neighbourhoods. So I was wondering if there were any statistics that there may not be on specific areas, but if you could perhaps just talk in a more general way on how you found low traffic neighbourhoods affecting officers on the ground particularly. And I should probably just give a sort of heads up to Commander Moore as well, who's coming afterwards, because of course, I'm going to have to ask him a very similar question. And also if there's any gender disparity within this, because what residents do write to me a lot about is that particularly women feel a lot more unsafe on the streets because there's less traffic in some of the quieter roads now, as opposed to walking down some of, there was a lot more passing traffic. And so I don't know how that sort of plays out both statistically and of any reports that you know of from the ground, particularly from your response teams who are operating on the ground on a day-to-day basis. So if you could just comment on that, please. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. I think the first thing I'd say, what concerns me in that is that you said, you've got a neighbourhood that are feeling unsafe. That's obviously a concern, because our job to make people safe in their own community. So that is definitely something of concern, and it's something I'd like to look at. In terms of overall response times, we We did have better response times in the first lockdown because there was no traffic on the road, I think the very first one, but we also had significantly less crimes. So in the overall picture, it sort of smoothed out over the year. In terms of low traffic neighborhoods, it has not impacted us significantly. We gave all our response vehicles keys for where we have bollard locks. We also adjusted our mapping around where the LTMs were. So it hasn't, I'm not aware of any issues. I haven't been on parade with my officers, my response teams, and have them, complaining or tell me issues around low traffic neighborhoods. So I'm not aware of any specific issues that have been caused to response times by that. If we need to get through, we can get through. But they're all programmed into our vehicles now, so we know where they are, and our route planning and stuff takes that into account. So I haven't seen a significant impact from them, to be honest. I know that our Central Road and Traffic Command, which is responsible for overall road and traffic policing, were consulted on the initiative before we went to play. But if I'm honest, it's not something that is on my agenda. That because cops don't mention it to me, so I'm not aware of any significant negative issues at all from it, if I'm honest.
Yeah. Okay, that's very, very reassuring to hear. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think the other bit of Gareth's question was around the perception of crime, so not just the response times, but you've seen an increase in, obviously there's the public perception of safety, and then there's the reality of how much crime is detected. Is there any discrepancy there?
I think there definitely is. I think there's two things that that massively impact on public perception of crime. One is our communications and what's in the public domain, what information is communicated, and the second is the visibility of police officers, and stewards of safety on the streets. I think our police officers are not as visible as I'd like them to be, and that's why we're having the investment in neighbourhood policing, because those are the visible policing on the ground, and that's why we're putting static visible posts into our high crime areas to give that visible presence and reassurance. The other thing is also we don't talk about the work we're doing nearly enough, and I don't want to talk about it from a look at us, look how well we're doing it, but I want to talk about it to residents to reassure them that the issues that affect them are issues that we take very seriously. So, for example, I know we've had a lot of residents talking about catalytic converter thefts, for example. We've done unbelievable work on that. We've stopped a couple of organized crime groups that we're stealing catalytic converters. All this kind of work's gone on, but we are not very effective at publishing that and talking about that. So I think in terms of the perception of crime, I think the perception is worse than reality, because crime is down. It is down, and particularly violent crime is down, particularly within that street-based violence crime. So that is the reality. But if we just look at one, extreme incident like the Sarah Everard incident, and that brings everybody's fears of similar incidents to the fore. So the perception is definitely different from the reality. But I think more visible policing, more visible cops on the streets, and better communication what we're doing will go a long way to reassuring most of those people, I hope.
Great, thank you. I've got Councillors Rice, Ball, Costigan, and Burke still. Sorry, so Councillor Rice.
Thank you, Chair. Just a first question to start off on, because it mentions about Isolate Manor Estate, and that's actually in my ward, and I'm just really interested to hear about how effective the work over there has been in order to deal with what I think you mention the N gang. Was that a gang that's operating in that area? And one thing we did do as councillors a little while ago is that we put a lot of work into ensuring that there was going to be decent CCTV on the Isolate Manor Estate. So I was actually just quite interested to know just how effective that has been and how helpful that has been towards your goal of reducing crime on the estate. And that also just leads me on to another issue that's going on at the council, that we've got Percival House, which is going to undergo some changes very soon if there's a planning permission that goes through. I'm just wondering about the CCTV room in there. I've visited there a couple of times. I'm extremely impressed by what you've got in there. I'll just be concerned to know that if there's going to be a change in location, will there be any kind of major interruption to the work of the CCTV control room? So obviously, as well as crime, obviously it's looking at other issues such as homelessness, and just ensuring that we do have proper social distancing in place. under the current crisis and under current circumstances. So to me, it would be very important to ensure that we do ensure that there is no interruption to the service that's there. And another question as well, if I may, please, on hate crime, because there's a lot of work that's been going through Parliament, especially from Stella Creasy MP, as regards making misogyny a hate crime, and just looking at, you've already touched on the Sarah Everard situation, and just looking at how we can improve the situation for women there. And there's one thing that you mentioned in the report is about increasing and improving the reporting of hate crimes. So one thing that's very much comes to mind when you think about crimes against women is that do we actually really feel like there's any point in reporting the crimes that are committed against us? Because people talk about maybe having better street lighting and issues such as that. But I can think back to the first time that I had anything against me that you could say was sexually related was in the middle of the afternoon when I was 7 years old. And in time since, I mean, I might found myself in a situation on the tube in front of a lot of people and not quite sure if someone was trying to touch me in an inappropriate way. So these are the kind of things that you're like, well, these things must happen all the time. Do we actually report them? I don't know if I do really as much as I should do. And is that a matter of because I lack confidence in that? Do I not really think there's much point? Do I think that I may be questioned about what evidence there was in order to back up my claims? So I'd just be interested to know how we could potentially respond to the hate crime misogyny, should that actually really become law and become something that we need to consider. Thank you.
Just a couple of issues for you there, Peter. Before you do, should I bring in Jess to talk about the CCTV control room, if that's all right?
Thank you, Councillor. So I just thought it might be helpful for us to answer that question, because that's actually a question for us, not necessarily Peter, although obviously they make great use of our CCTV. So we're in a dialogue at the moment to look at a transfer in a new location. I've got a location identified and I'm working through with other parts of the organisation that might be based out of that to create a 24-hour hub. So that would include our CCTV, also parking, also care line, and also hopefully be able to operate some of our enforcement teams, potentially some police officers, which I'm in a dialogue with Jill Horsfield, one of Peter's superintendents, about. So regulatory services, some of Paul's Safer Communities guys, all those guys being operated out of one site, and that being a 24-hour site. So Saturday in the evenings, during the week, we can operate our ASB patrols and stuff out of that. So that work's ongoing. And because of the changes we made to our system when we moved from the town hall to Percival House, the downtime for the system now should be literally less than a day, because we should be able to just flick a switch, because we're now operating on a cloud, not on the old school kind of physical recording equipment and things like that. So I'm hopeful that it should all go very smoothly, fingers crossed, and there should be no downtime really at all, and the police should have the benefit of that system. So that's just to field that one question. I'll hand back to Peter for the other items.
Thanks, Jess. So Peter, back to you for those other couple of questions.
Okay, so I'll start with Asset Man, and then I'll go into hate crime. So certainly the work around the Designing Up Crime team, which is based up in Rice, they come down and do it. They do it for the whole of the Met. That we're lucky to have them on our BCU. The work around that is invaluable. I always say that we're far too reactive around crime, and it's much better to be preventative and obviously prevent the crime in the first instance. And CCTV and designing out crime in terms of cutting back hedgerows, etc., is essential to that. The work around Hyssop Manor has been significant, and it has been supported not only by BCU assets, but we've also had the territorial support group in there and some of our Viper units. After we had associated shootings across the border in Hayes, which were linked to the end game coming back across. So we've had significant police activity in the area, and it is starting to pay dividends. We have seen that downturn in violence there. So I think the work that we've done there and the role that the CCTV has played in designing our crime team, and the role that the neighbourhood team and the borough and the council team have played has been absolutely invaluable. But we've got a lot more to do there. So we're not out of the woods there by any stretch of the imagination. With regards to hate crime, firstly, I would say always report it. Always report it. And that's a message I give to any victim of crime. Because whether or not you think it's likely to go somewhere, it might be that it prevents someone else from being a victim. It might be that we can link up other evidence that we have from other crime that link back to what's happened to yourself, which allows us to do a better picture of the perpetrator. It might be that it allows you some closure as a victim. It might be that allows you access to support services. It might be that allows us, hopefully, to get somebody who's a predator off the streets. So the first comment I'd say is when it comes to hate crime, I always encourage people to report it. Our ambition is, when it comes to hate crime, we are, we're prosecuting over 15% now of offenders that come to us. I want to get that up to at least 25% over the next couple of years. And that's, I think, is a realistic target. But more importantly, it allows us to, to really work around a victim-centric approach, which I think is different to what we've probably done, sort of 20, 30 years ago, where the investigation is done from the perspective of what the needs of the victim are. And sometimes that victim needs a reassurance to know it's not going to happen again because we've locked the person up. Sometimes that victim needs the offer to be able to speak through what's happened and to be able to access support services that we can introduce them to, as well as the brilliant third sector organizations which are referenced in this report. So always, I think, I encourage people to report hate crime. Misogyny should come into law in September, is my understanding, if everything goes as expected, as a hate crime. That is something that we're looking at the moment in terms of the ramifications for us. It will become, I assume, will be treated as other hate crimes. So we'll either have as an aggravating factor, or as for example, like we would have a racial element as an aggravating factor. So we have it either it's misogynistic in terms of motivation, or it's misogynistic in terms of aggravation. But we wait to see exactly what the legislation that comes out off the back of that does look like. In addition, what we're doing at the moment, we're doing a complete review of, we've done quite a lot of analysis of where all our hotspots are in terms of street level crime against women and girls. And we're using that data to go into our fixed post program, our Rock Palladium, etc., to make sure that we can both put officers into those areas and design out crime in those areas as best we can. So it is something that's right at the top of our agenda, but with misogyny, we still wait to see what that legislation looks like when it comes through.
Thanks. Councillor Ball, you've been waiting very patiently, not nearly as patiently as Councillors Costigan and Burke, who are still after you, but John.
Yes, thanks, Chair. Two questions, if that's all right. So the first one is about the COVID enforcement in kind of parks and streets. There was a very clear difference between initially in the first lockdown. There were officers going around parks, breaking up picnics, and moving couples on having picnics, that sort of thing. And then in the second lockdown, it was kind of officers were approaching large groups, but leaving other people alone. And now it's kind of gone to the other extreme, where there seems to be just sort of reassurance policing. There's without, and they don't seem to be approaching people at all. So I think probably it was overzealous in the first place. I'm not necessarily objecting to the direction of travel, but I just wondered if there's anything you could say about to what extent is that your decisions, or to what extent is it Met wide, and kind of what was the thinking at the various stages in terms of in enforcing the rules about being out and about in public spaces.
Okay. So it's been a Met-wide consistent approach. We've tried to be consistent with other police forces, also through the National Police Chiefs Council, in terms of approach we've taken. So we took what we called the 4 E's approach, which is first to engage, second explain, third encourage, and fourth enforce. The first lockdown, the key issue was most of what we were doing was explaining to people, because people weren't aware of the legislation and the rules. So it's like, this is what's going on. This is why you can't gather. This is how the legislation has changed. This is a risk. Please, would you kindly move on? And people were. By the time the second lockdown came, there was enough information in the public domain that really people should know and should be in a position where they understand exactly what risks they're taking, what risks they're posing to others by choosing. And at that point, I think it's a deliberate choice to breach the COVID legislation. I think in the first lockdown, It is a lack of understanding because it's new legislation. It's never been implemented before. It's a complete change to how we do things. By the time we're in a national crisis with huge peaks in terms of deaths and infections, and it being on every news channel almost 24 hours a day, the excuses around, I wasn't aware, I'm not really there anymore. So whilst we still went through the 4 years approach of, engaging, explaining, encouraging, enforcing, we were going much faster through the explanation phase because really people should have known better. So you saw an increase in the issuance of fines because people really had no lawful excuse, and people really did and were aware of the legislation and chose to breach it in any event. The focus was on groups because that posed the biggest risk. In the second lockdown was also, if you remember, at the same time, we had significant issues around unlicensed music events, etc., and large gatherings. So a lot of the approaches to groups was to nip that type of activity in the bud and prevent it from escalating. It's much easier to deal with a small group of 10 people than once it's gathered to a group of 50, 100 people. So that was the approach that we're taking. Where we are now, obviously, we're still going through that process. You have seen, a relaxing in some of the guidance in terms of that's come out from both government as well as from the National Police Chiefs Council, and we're doing our best to implement that, in the sense that's intended. Nobody is here trying to criminalize somebody for just going out for their afternoon, walk, which is part of their exercise, etc. But we are intent on stopping those who are choosing to gather in large groups and clearly pose a risk to themselves and others. So that would explain the slight difference, I think, in approaches between the different lockdowns.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. The other question is about the police estate in Ealing. So obviously the front counters closed at Ealing Police Station and Southall Police Station a couple of years ago now, and also at Chiswick, which is just outside. So Acton's the only front counter, and you mentioned the works that are going on. Is the Acton front counter going to close at any point during those works? And if so, what are the alternative arrangements? And then the other related question is Ealing Police Station as a base to operate from, is that secure long term? I know there were talks about closing that altogether and moving a lot of officers to a kind of a base with vehicles on an industrial estate sort of thing. Is that still a possibility, or is there a central Ealing presence definitely continuing?
Okay, so I'll take those points as they were given. Acton front counter remains open. If for any reason during the work you have to close Acton front counter, we will open Ealing front counter. So there is no intention of changing that. That should remain open throughout. If the contractors tell us it's absolutely necessary, then we will open Ealing, and that will be well publicised and communicated to the public. In terms of the long-term strategy, Ealing Police Station is on the disposal list. It is a difficult police station for us to operate from, because of the very small yard there. That is a decision and timing of which I don't foresee taking place in the next 18 months. Clearly, there's significant investment in Acton. Acton is going to be part of our long-term estate, and it's likely that if Ealing does close at that point in time, and I can't tell you that is or is not going to happen or when that's going to happen, but were it to close, we still have Acton Police Station and Southall Police Station, which will be our main bases in the area.
I mean, just as a follow-up, if that's all right, Chair.
Very quickly, John.
Very quickly. I mean, do you recognise that it's important to have some sort of permanent presence near central Ealing, because there are so many people in that part of the borough, and there are concerns amongst residents if there were to be no kind of permanent presence there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I completely recognise that the estate strategy is obviously, it's a longer-term strategy, and it's not looked on a borough basis, but on a pan-London basis. But I completely understand that concern. whatever does happen in the future, you can be assured that if it's not a police station, there will certainly be neighbourhood bases there, and there will certainly still be static patrols and neighbourhood patrols, as well as sort of roving patrols by our response teams into those areas. So whilst the future of that station will be what it will be, and I can't say at this stage. I'm hoping that will be done in a manner as we have done in other areas where we've had to close down police stations, where the impact on local policing is negligible and hopefully won't be noticed by residents.
Thanks. Councillor Costigan.
Thanks, Chair. One of the problems of putting your hand up late is that most of your questions get asked. So Councillor Ball has really just covered a question I was going to ask, but just to sort of come in on the end of it, I represent North Holt Mandeville, and there is a police office beside the leisure centre, and residents often just ask us what is going on in there. So I recognise that it's not a proper front counter, but is there an answer we can give residents as to what that's for, and what the kind of long-term plan is for those kind of offices that are basically shut to the public? And the other thing was just again, my ward colleague Councillor Rice has touched on this, the work that's been done in Islip Manor, which we absolutely welcome, and it sounds really amazing work, and we were very happy to be involved in the CCTV rollout. But this is probably a question for Paul rather than for the Met. There's a mention of this environmental audit that I think Peter just ran through in responding to Councillor Rice. But as local councillors, we didn't know anything about this environmental audit. We haven't heard about it. We were very involved in the CCTV rollout, but we were unaware of the environmental audit and the kind of mention of, cutting back trees and that kind of thing. It sounds great, but it would have been good to know about it. And could you tell us a little bit more about it? Thanks.
Shall I jump in at this point, Chair? Sorry.
Sure. Yeah, if you think that would be helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, Councillor Costigan. I think what that refers to, and again, please do correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it refers to the recent piece of work that was done by the Met's Designing Out Crime team, who recently did an inspection, and it was. Ah, right, okay. And it was a joint inspection. I believe it was undertaken with a member of my team as well. I think there's, as a result of that, a report is being pulled together. Be very happy to share the details of that report with absolutely the 3 ward councillors. And apologies not to have included you in at a pseudo point, councillor. Once that initial report is done, there'll be some follow-up work done around it. And I certainly know no work will be started, if you like, until we've actually engaged a bit more with not just yourselves, but also with members of the community. That sort of comes back a little bit to the work that's being done around the council spaces panel as well. So some of the work that's being done in the other hotspot areas that we've identified from that, parts of, for example, Norwood Green, parts of the Greenford Northolt borders, and parts of East Acton, which we're looking at. And again, we'll be making sure that local councillors are fully briefed on that. In fairness, I think it's probably because this is a little bit early days in this approach. But yeah, apologies if there was a sense that you weren't involved, because I was aware, Councillor yourself, Councillor Rice, Councillor Summers, I know, were out and about with Hazel, Karen, and some of the team. But it wouldn't have been this time last year. It probably would have been this time in 2019, doing some of the scoping out work around that CCTV system. So yeah, absolutely, you'd be key in being informed in that.
Great, thanks very much for that commitment,
Cool.
Paul.
Thanks.
Great. And then Peter, do you want to pick up the points on what it looks like at a contact centre, or kind of the points around what these things look like for residents?
Yeah. So firstly, there's obviously as part of the estate strategy and then the cutback that we've gone through over the last few years, there are a number of police stations which we are not viable for us to run as operational police stations anymore, and so we have withdrawn from those. Most of those that are shuttered and barred are on the disposal list, and our property estate team will look to dispose of them in due course. In terms of contacts to local residents, what the ward officers will be doing, and which they continue to do, is they will advertise, I call them clinics, I think they call them contact points, which is as and where they're going to be available for local residents to bring issues to them locally that they just want their local ward officers, etc., to be aware of. So those contact points can take place sort of anywhere, because all our officers now carry the next generation tablets which access all Met systems on them, etc. and can take it and file a crime report there and then, instead of having to go back to a station as they did even 18 months ago. So those contact points are advertised by the ward officers on all the communications channels that have social media, etc. But a lot of that estate, which is shuttered and boarded, and it's not just that station, a lot of that is due to be disposed of.
Thanks. Councillor Burke and then Councillor Driscoll. And then I think we're done with the questions for you, Peter.
Just a couple of quickies going forward and how we can help, really. So thinking with, one is about, I think it was Gareth's point about people being very anxious about crime. Sure, I think largely because they're sitting in their own homes. And where we can point people to reassure them about all the activity that you're all doing, an easy access to that, you know, that there is information that's it's low crime, etc. So where's the comms around this that we can easily point people to? And then the second one is about, I can see Easter weekend, you know, if it's sunny particularly, a lot of people getting very anxious about groups of teens, etc., etc. I'm already getting people talking to me about that. What would you like us to be doing in terms of how we advise our residents? You know, if there's 8 teenagers together rather than 6, or, you know, they're having a few drinks or what have you, do you want them to be reporting it to the police? Do you want us to be trying to, you know, keep people calm about it? It really, it's, you know, what's your line on that, and how do you want us to take it forward?
Certainly, I'll start with the communication thing. So I think our challenge is a lot of our communication is done on social media via, you know, be it a Facebook page or Twitter, or and not all residents access that. So I think that's a challenge on our side as to how we better communicate, how we better communicate through existing channels that we have. So the council is very good in helping support and reinforce our comms through their channels. But I think we need to get a little bit more astute and a little bit more on our front foot around how we communicate to residents. Because let's face it, residents don't get up in the morning and check, you know, the Metropolitan Police Ealing, you know, Facebook feed. I don't think that's generally what they do. So it's how do we, how do we insert our communications into the existing channels that they're looking at. So that is a challenge for us, and I've invested in a comms team now. So we've put some more resources in that to make sure that we do that effectively. But it is a challenge, and it will remain a challenge until we get that right. I think in terms of the Easter bank holidays, we are expecting warm weather at this point in time. We are expecting a lot of people to be out and about. We'll have a significant policing operation in place across London. We're also being supported by some assets which are coming to us from some of the central teams. Listen, the law is what it is, and if people are breaching it, I would like it reported. Okay. Because even if we are not able to act at that time because we're dealing with something more urgent, it starts to paint an intelligence picture and starts to paint a picture of what is going on the street. But if things do develop, then we are we're better aware and better equipped. So I'm not asking people to be, proactively out there hunting, groups of people, etc. But if you do notice something and it is concerning to you as a resident, and you think we should know, then let us know. And we may not be able to respond immediately if we've got other higher risk incidents that we're dealing with. But even if we don't respond immediately, it allows us to start to paint a picture of what's happening on the ground in the areas where we're not responding. So if something happens, in the next couple of hours, we've got a much better understanding of what's going on.
Thanks. Councillor Driscoll has been joined by Councillors Woodruff and DeRosca on the list, but after that we're going to move on because Ben has been waiting patiently to talk about the work of the Fire Brigade, and we also have the rest of the report to talk about. So Councillor Driscoll.
Thank you, Chair. There's a couple of things in the report that I wanted to pick up on. One was incidences of robberies in the Pitsanger Lane area. Because they sound very much similar to what happened in 2019 in the Walpole and Northfields wards, and I represent Northfields in Walpole and Mammoth Parks, but not exclusively in those areas. And I know at the time there was a lot of cooperation with council services and the police, and I was in dialogue with Paul Murphy in the Safer Communities side. So I'm just wondering what learning was applied from what happened in 2019 and how that was applied, and given that we're about partnership here, how did that come about, and what were the learning points that were continued from that or applied, or what was done differently even. So that would be helpful to know. When it talks about mental health and talks about a 23% increase of the use of a section 136, if you can just very succinctly tell me what a 136 is so everybody knows what that is. But I'm curious to know, are this increase people whose first encounter with mental health provision is an incident with the police, and the link and the dialogue between mental health services and the police and other services and how they work together? Because it would be concerning if their first encounter is with the police as an encounter with an official structure. So that'd be curious to know. Communication was mentioned a few times, and I know the Met did publicise, I think it was 300 officers and 30 dawn raids to do with catalytic converters thefts that had happened this week, which is great to hear, because I know that it's about a year ago in Northfields we had quite a spike in that side of incidents happening. So getting that message out that things are being done about all these type of activities, and like the violence against women and girls in the report, communicating that, and having some, because I know there's some antisocial behaviour work going on in South Ealing with more patrols and CCTV deployed and officers coming in from other areas. So it's a real concerted effort in South Ealing to actually address an issue. But communicating that out, or you might not communicate it then and there because it's operational issues, but to have case studies where people can be reassured. And I know Councillor Shaw mentioned about women feeling less secure at night, but understanding all these things that are happening. And we have our own communications, so it'd be interesting to see how we can use the council's communications, like Ealing Extra, which is digital, so we're not limited to a number of pages, as it were, how that can be used to show some case studies and exemplars. So I'll leave my questions there, but there's probably enough to go on with that. Thank you very much.
Right, can we also take, sorry, Peter, can we take Simon and Joanna's questions as well, and then you can tackle them all and we can more efficiently. So Simon and then Joanna, and then Peter, if you want to sum up.
Well, actually, catalytic converters have been quite a big thing in my ward of Greenford Green recently, and there was an item on it on tonight's London and South East News, so quite an issue. I think I'm interested in. I think there's a lot of stuff about domestic abuse recently, and reading the report, it seems to imply that it's kind of worse here than it is in lots of other areas in London. I was just wondering if you've got a handle on why that should be, and if it's something we as councillors in the local area should know and should be doing something about. It's really why it would be higher here than other areas.
Thanks. And Joanna.
Thank you. It's a question. It's a two audience question. So one to the police and to safer communities in council. I came across the LBE CCTV map, which is available online. And I know that there are gaps in certain parts of the borough, namely in my ward, in Common. And so the question, because of the map, it creates a more sort of for any criminals a strategic way of finding the black holes where there is no CCTV. So is it a good idea to have this information online on the Ealing Council website? And does the police take this into consideration when, for example, having foot patrols in those areas where there is no CCTV? Thank you.
Okay.
Great, Peter. Do you want to tackle all those, and then we can move to safe communities for their response on that one.
Okay. Okay. So I'll start with Pitanga Lane. So clearly some parallels there. Robbery of schoolboys. There were learnings there. We were early into into the schools offices to paint a picture of activity in the area and people in the area. We knew from the work that we were doing from the investigative side that was likely a small team or a couple of people. So that allowed us to build an intelligence picture, which was quite clear, and then allowed us to get in there and make the arrest. So as soon as we've done that, it's clear that we've arrested the right people because there's been no more incidents of the robbery there. So there's certainly some learnings about how we worked together with the schools teams previously came into that operation, and it was an effective operation. It was supported by the local authority to help with a lot of the comms around that. In terms of Section 136, so the policing powers around mental health are different to NHS powers around mental health. So Section 136 is a police power which allows us to effectively what we call section, but it's really to safeguard a person for their own safety who is in a public place and poses a risk of serious harm or injury to either themselves or other members of the public. Now, often these people are volatile and dangerous, and generally when we get called either by a member of public or it's often by the NHS themselves who call us and say, listen, we're dealing with this, but we need some assistance. And then it is, if an officer feels it is necessary to protect that person, so for example, somebody who might be suicidal and attempting to commit suicide, or somebody who is posing a risk to others because of the behaviour that they're displaying, they can choose, to justify the use of a 136. Generally, we will always have the NHS in situ with us when we do that, but not always, because sometimes, that behaviour may display itself as somebody running through the street with a knife, for example. That's not a call that would normally go out to the NHS. It would come to us first. We do have a very close working relationship with the mental health team at the NHS. We actually have a sergeant and a team embedded at St Bernard's, which is a mental health hospital, and we have very good links with all the secure bed wards across the area. So it is not a perfect system, and it is not ideal because we are generally called to those people when they're at that moment of acute desperation or acute crisis, shall we say, whereas ultimately the NHS is looking at their long-term mental health and how to stabilise them over the longer term. What we're dealing with is removing that risk that person poses to themselves or the public in the immediacy of whilst they pose that risk. So it's a powerful piece of legislation. It's one that we use when we have to. It's not one that officers like using. But when we need to, we will use it, and it's a very important tool that we have. The increase, I think, is partly to do with lockdowns. Certainly, I think being in this artificial environment that we've had for so long has certainly accentuated that, and so we're certainly seeing that as part of the challenge that we're facing at the moment. In terms of communications, I think we've talked about that extensively, so I won't go into that in too much detail. In terms of domestic abuse, I guess the question is, why is it higher here than perhaps other parts of the Met? I think a number of factors. One is the concentration of population we have across the West London, right? So we have just shy of, between the three boroughs, 1 million residents across this corner of London. So we do have a high concentration of population there. We also have a higher concentration of houses of multiple occupancy, of multi-generational families living together than perhaps some areas. And some of that is demographic, and some of it is historical, and some is to do, is linked to the ethnic background of the South Asian community, for example. And all those factors come into play. There's not any one reason why I can say domestic abuse is higher here than elsewhere. I think it would be interesting to look at it as compared to other areas as a percentage of the population, etc. But in terms of when I say domestic abuse is high here, I'm talking about simply calls or demand that's coming into us, rather than sort of domestic abuse offences per 1,000 population, if that makes sense. In terms of CCTV, do we take that into account of our patrols? Our patrol strategy is based on where we feel our hotspots of crime are, so where crime is being reported, and where our analysts and our intelligence people tell us crime is likely to happen. So the absence of CCTV generally wouldn't be a factor in that, unless the absence means there's more crime in that area, in which case it will come up. But I can't say that we look through the map and say there's no CCTV there, we need to put a police officer there. No, we look at where's crime happening and where's it most likely to happen, and that's where we try to put our officers. And obviously, as you can imagine, it's certainly not an exact science, and there's a lot of of interpretation that comes into that. But that, but I'm not aware of us adjusting patrol strategies based on where or where not CCTV coverage is. So often, if we do want to keep an eye on an area, the council CCTV is incredibly useful for that, and certainly does help.
Great, Peter. Thank you so much for
all of the questions.
I think so. I've kind of been trying to mentally ticking them off as you've gone along, but you've done very well. Thank you, and thank you for you giving up your time this evening, and obviously to all your officers for their hard work this year, as ever. Do feel free to stay on the call if you'd like, because we will come back to some of the kind of areas where there is overlap with the Safer Communities team, but equally feel free to go and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, everybody, for your questions, and I'll pass the thanks on to the officers.
Great, thanks. Jess, did you want to come in on the CCTV point about having that map, Jess or Paul, first, before we then move on to Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. It's it's a good question, Councillor, about the published map that we have of all of our CCTV cameras. It's not a question, unfortunately, about whether it's sort of, I guess, a good or a bad idea to have it. It's actually a requirement that we are absolutely transparent and accountable about where we're deploying CCTV. Any location that we have CCTV cameras at, there has to be an identified pressing need for why we've chosen to go for that location. The Information Commissioner's Office and the Surveillance Camera Commission both require that. So having it in a fairly visible place on our website as well is seen as good practice, and is seen as a sort of any public body being very transparent about where it deploys. We obviously don't use covert cameras. We would need to go through a whole process of a RIPA authorization for any sort of covert operation. What we do have, of course, which won't always be updated in a live sense on that map, would be the deployable visible cameras. So we do have a number of deployable cameras that we will often put in certain areas for time sensitive periods of time. In fact, it takes me back to the question, I think, from Councillor Driscoll about, we will remember that we had a deployable camera that was particularly put out to the Walpole-Lammas area during the time that we had the robberies concerned during 2019, and some consideration was given to that during the pit hang. In fact, I was in, I think, a conversation not long ago with Councillor Burke about that particular issue in Pitshanger. But yeah, it's a requirement, and it was all about transparency and accountability as a public body, unfortunately, in that area.
Great, thank you, Paul. Ben Moore, Commander Ealing for London Fire Brigade. Ben, thank you so much for your patience, and sorry that our questions for the police have taken so long, but do you want to take us through your section of the report, and then we'll have any questions from members. Thanks, Ben.
No problem. And yes, so good evening all. Ben Moore, Borough Commander of London Fire Brigade for Ealing. I will take it that if we've seen the report and have reports in front or have read through, so I will be brief and really give the headline figures in preparation for questions. So as we've all discussed previously, I would think it has been nothing but a slightly challenging year with COVID regulations in place. However, I am pleased to say that we have managed to maintain our operational response throughout as business as usual as a format, but with some extra activities on top. But in terms of the basic figures, primary dwelling fires, so insurable loss for the year, are down and beneath our notional internal targets for driving safety across London, but specifically within Ealing Borough. We do have an increase, or have had an increase in what are determined as colloquially called code 2s, but it's uninsurable loss, so outdoor rubbish fires or outdoor fires or non-insurable property fires. And that would be a significant increase attributed to, on the whole, slightly anecdotally, evidence of weather conditions, obviously outside, confinement and lockdowns to more people staying within their properties, and having things like bonfires going out of control, or rubbish fires and such like. And that has been quite significant, particularly in the more west of areas of Ealing Borough, where there's been a sort of a noticeable increase towards the beginning of the fiscal year. So this time last year, most pertinently. Linked to that, we had a very, very slight increase in deliberate fires, but what I will say is in the statistical data for that, there is some recording issues in that. The way we actually record and collect data in that process, in preparation for the Home Office, the criteria for that may be an indicator that deliberate fires are going up, but it may not actually be the case of what you would notionally class as arson, and so that I've been clear that isn't actually the case for that particular statistic. Then there's a figure 9 for the primary fire, secondary fires, and you'll see the notional LFB sort of borough averages where we are there or thereabouts, and that's attributed to our ongoing community fire safety work. But I'll come on to that shortly. But as you can see there, very much indicates that secondary fires are significantly higher than previous years, and are significantly above the London borough averages. And that may be in some part to the particular sort of makeup and of certain parts of borough. So as I said, last year has been a particularly challenging, not least within our community safety work, where we are striving to be sort of focal points in the communities and our fire stations to be that, opening up our fire stations to be more of a sort of a public domain, and within our community fire safety work, which is predicated through our community fire safety plans at a local level, effectively giving advice within the home. And as you will appreciate, during lockdown conditions, that's significantly more difficult to achieve. And coupled with the fact that our target audience for prevention of serious injury and worse is the particularly high risk individuals that we determine and try to identify and locate were in the early stages also mirroring that of the most at risk from serious complications should they contract COVID. So it was a particularly challenging environment. And our usual annual figures of targets for completing 3,165 home fire safety visits, where we visit properties and give advice and install smoke detection where appropriate and where necessary, has just not been achievable under the circumstances. We also have, in terms of protecting ourselves and frontline services for operational incidents and protecting the public, have a triage process in place where we will attend the absolute high risk, imminent danger cases, of which we have completed at the time of the report just over 500. Sorry, I meant to mention that obviously in compiling the report, we prepared the data some time ago, so there's not a full fiscal year, as you will appreciate. And then an overview of a broad range of incident types. So please ask afterwards if specific details in terms of some of my terminology. So But I'll run through, as you can see, primary fires, so insurable loss of effectively accidental dwelling fires or fires within premises that are workspaces or industrial spaces. Is significantly down on last year, which is very pleasing. And from a personal note, in terms of fires in the home, there would be an expectancy with the amount of, well, it was a personal expectancy with them, with people using houses as their places of work and places of entertainment and being confined to during lockdown periods. There was a feeling, well, personal feeling that we may see an increase in accidental dwelling fires. And actually, that's not been the case. People will be potentially more vigilant and more aware. As I said, secondary fires, so non-insurable fires have gone up slightly, and it may be due to, as I said, the other reasons of more people at home, rubbish fires, barbecues, similar to gardens, and other elements. AFAs are automatic fire alarms, and it's a significant reduction in the amount of attendances or calls we've had to those. Again, attributed to COVID and lockdown, where places of work are not places of work anymore. And then lastly, special services, a technical term given to any non-fire related rescues that we may be recalled to. So such as there's road traffic collisions, rescues from height, or rescues from other places such as water incidents. Shut-in lift releases, so on an emergency basis, where we may get called to assist in that aspect. And again, with the lockdown conditions and COVID conditions, at some points there's been significantly less traffic on the roads, less people in the workplace. We've had significantly lower amounts of emergency calls to shut-in lifts, which are all attributed to quite a significant reduction in our special service calls. In terms of our community, I've covered our community fire safety plan already, but we have continued throughout the year with our regulatory fire safety work. So that's our enforcement teams dealing with the built environment, have continued their work, and there will certainly be challenges ahead in the coming year with changes to legislation, but particularly high-rise residential buildings. But we've got lots of plans in place to deal with that, with a significantly larger amount of inspections that will be required under the government changes, particularly in the residential sort of high-rise building arena. Sorry, I've gone slightly out of sequence, but figure 11 is going back to my points about home fire safety and community fire safety work, and the numbers that we've managed to achieve throughout the year. On a sort of broader spectrum, we have continued to roll out our youth engagement programs, in particular LFB cadets in the borough, where we had some mayoral funding to introduce a new unit. As you will appreciate, that hasn't been possible to run on a face-to-face basis, but I am pleased to say that we do have LFB cadets running in conjunction with Harrow Borough as a virtual engagement solutions, with the intention that when we can, and going back to a more normal business, that will then, a unit will then be in place at one of the fire stations within the borough to continue that youth engagement work. As a sort of larger look forward, we are continuing to our work within the COVID environment with our other work, not just our operational response and maintaining business continuity. And within the report, there's some facts and figures that we have, LFB is engaged in various works. So continuing to, well, we are still continuing, and staff from Ealing are still continuing to assist the LAS with driving ambulances during the pandemic. We have been involved in, such as staff making, across London, over 40,000 face shields. We've been involved in delivering PPE for NHS and care services around. We've also been assisting where we can with food banks and delivering of food parcels and medicines to vulnerable residents, and in particular around well, there's some support to Gurnell food parcel and food charity up from there. But we couldn't do the delivery, unfortunately, but we were assisting with some of the logistics. And as I say, we're looking forward to next year, where we will be continuing our work to implement our transformation delivery plan in response to the Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabularies and Fire Rescue Services, and continue work with following the Grenfell Tower inquiries and improving our delivery and our work within the communities, and in particular our training environments and dealing with challenging and large-scale incidents. And as I've already mentioned, we will also be investing a lot of time and effort into the building safety under the fire safety regulation arena, and accepting the challenge of the changes to legislation for building safety and high-rise residential buildings that is due for royal assent in the not too distant future. All whilst at the time is also challenging our sort of delivery models and how we are delivering our other statutory obligations, such as major incidents and acts of terrorism. So that, in a brief nutshell, is what we've delivered last year or this year, and our continued look forward. In addition to that, there's some other announcements recently that we will be conducting a cultural review and hopefully changing and shaping the LFB for the future and the ever-changing risks that we face continue to make people safer within Ealing and within London. So at that point, I think it might be good to open up to questions. What I will say actually before I do is for Councillor Ball, a question about LTNs. I'll preempt that one. Say that yes, I think it's fair to say LTNs have been a hot topic, and if there are any questions about LTNs, I will have to, on the whole, defer back to the council. But what I can say is that I have a very good working relationship with the council. We regularly converse on the subject of LTNs and consultation. I can say that currently within Ealing, we have service standard measures for appliance attendance or fire engine attendance to incidents. And that standard is an average of 6 minutes for your first fire engine and 8 minutes for the second fire engine. We're currently running in Ealing a first appliance attendance time of 5 minutes 8 seconds, and the second appliance is 6 minutes 30 seconds, which is based on that's the last 12 months. It's based on 5,270 mobilisations. So it's we are well within our service standard targets, and a slightly more sort of point focus. I've chosen the stations of Acton and Ealing purely because of the being more LTNs within the station's grounds or the patches that they would cover. There's more LTNs than Southall and Northolt, for example. So Acton, we're looking at first appliance attendance of 4 minutes 44, and Ealing for 4 minutes 47 currently, which is very good in comparison to our targets. So there we go. So lastly, what we will be doing moving on in the future is we, under the COVID legislation and the mayor's funding bills, moving forward as an organisation, our funding streams will be changed slightly, and then that will be a challenging environment, it has to be said, in the years coming. But we will be looking at how we meet those funding bills and our delivering models and our core operations through what we call our community risk management plan, Now, in years gone by, that was called the London Safety Plan as an overarching document for the LFB, as the London Safety Plan 15. The Community Risk Management Plan is being constructed as we speak, but I will be in the process of coming out and doing community engagement and asking communities and community groups how and what they would like from the London Fire Brigade, and that will definitely be included within the plans moving forward and taken into consideration. Okay, so I shall open up to questions now.
Great, thanks, Ben. Councillor Shaw has got his hand up. I don't know if that's to follow up on the LTN response times. Gareth?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Sorry, just trying to switch the video on as well. Yes, thank you, Chair.
My apologies. I've got Councillor Paul and yourself mixed up there. I was looking for searching for the names on the screen. Apologies.
Yeah, that's quite all right. Yeah. So I did trial the question to you. So thanks for that detailed answer. I mean, it is obviously very reassuring to hear that you know the standards of the 6 minutes and 8 minutes. You know, you're hitting really well. So I'm sure residents will be really pleased to hear that. You mentioned about the relationship with the council and it being a strong working relationship. So just early on with some of the low traffic neighbourhoods, I mean, I had numerous emails, you know, all sending me videos of fire engines either sort of struggling to make turns where planters were or other things. So could you just talk me through just how that was checked by the crews on the ground, just to sort of show how that relationship's actually working for us, please?
Sorry, I'm not quite sure the question. You're asking what we checked with during the consultation process?
Yes. So during the early implementation of the low traffic neighbourhoods, there were some issues. I believe one sort of fire engine got stuck and couldn't quite make it sort of round a corner because planters were placed diagonally and it couldn't make a turn. You know, and this was used particularly via social media and on Facebook and so on, and there were sort of other videos being trialled like that at times, and I did have sort of reported back to me that you were out with council officers actually checking the distances and making sure that the positions were correct of planters. So I was just wondering if you could confirm if that had happened, you know, to your knowledge. Obviously, I appreciate you wouldn't have been involved in that necessarily, but just how that relationship of working with the council and how quick the feedback is to the council where there is a problem so it can be sorted out quickly.
Yes, so we've been engaged in the consultation process from start to finish, and we provide our commentary and our guidance documentation for what the expectancy and for traffic officers to note that we have certain attendance times and our effectively statistics of what we would require in those circumstances. So widths of fire engines, length of fire engines, those things, and in terms of any feedback, if we have a feedback and reporting process to crews encounter issues, which is rare, I have to say, but I am aware of some Facebook videos that have been shown and they've been dealt with. But we have regular meetings with the traffic officers where that is reported back as it happens or as it is reported, and they're dealt with. Yes.
Okay, good. That is reassuring to hear and know that sort of close working relationship does happen. And
yes,
if I could just ask, very briefly as well, just thinking about the cadet scheme, because I know you spoke about launching this a little while ago. You know, it's great to hear that you've actually got it up and running well, you know, alongside Harrow at the moment. Could I just ask sort of how many people that's engaging with, and you know, you say you plan to base it out of a station. Do you know where that station may be in the future, or does that depend on uptake and numbers and so on?
Yes. So the idea is that when we can, we will be relocating out to a station. It does depend on the facilities we have available at the station. So it's likely to be within Acton, South, or possibly Ealing. There's certain requirements we need in terms of the buildings and the infrastructure within the fire stations, obviously. But normal units would be ranging from around about 16 cadets, with the support officers, and we also have a scheme from cadets and moving to the officer ranks. So we have senior officer cadets, which are sort of mentors within that process, and we have the cadet instructors. There would be sort of cohorts between 16 to 20, but probably more like about the 16 level on a weekly basis, where they'll go through and do the qualifications and MVQ process over the course of a year. So I can't say for certain which station is going to be located at, but it will be running out of a station as and when we can facilitate it. Currently, I believe there's in terms of the virtual engagement, I think there's 10 at the moment. I haven't got the full details in front of me, so I apologise for that. But it is running and looking, and we're always attempting to try and grow that. Yes.
No, that's great. I mean, well done on getting the scheme up and running in very challenging times. Yeah.
I have to say I can't take full credit for our youth engagement teams and our cadet teams that do some fantastic work, and doing it all remotely. It has been a challenge, I know, but I do take my hat off to them to be able to facilitate that. But thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Councillor Ball, you're looming on the video as if to come in. Was that just because you were named, or did you have a question?
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, no, I just sort of.
Although you've now frozen for me.
I was asking a question. No, it's fine. It's fine. I'm not trying to ask a question.
Great. Joanna.
Thank you. I've got a question with regards to the response times. You mentioned the 6 minutes and the 8 minutes, and then your real information about being 5 minutes, 8 seconds, and 6:30. So if I missed a word, were those average response times?
Yes, they are, yes.
Okay, average. What would be interesting is to see if the longest times were recorded and whether that's changed, because fire stations are fixed abodes, and you will have like a locus, how long it will take to the furthest point away from, say, any fire station, for example. You'll have it, for example, Acton Fire Station, so you might use that to reach Park Royal, for example, because it'll be the closest possibly, or from the other borough. So you'll have your sort of locus mapped out in terms of which station engines should go out in if there's a fire. So because LTNs have been mostly, I'm not saying all, but mostly be focused around sort of the central Ealing area, sort of the Northfields, Walpole area, have those times been extended, or those were passing through, say, main arteries, say Uxbridge Road? It'll be interesting to see whether the maximum or the longest time frames have been extended. So that's one question. And the second question is, you mentioned on that you're hitting your targets into getting within time. That's great. But what was the data in the prior year, so pre-pandemic? I also have another question, is have you done any mapping or statistical analysis of these timings, but lockdown versus no lockdown? Because during lockdown, everybody's at home and they're not going to school, for example, not going to work. Other than shopping, there are fewer cars. Once schools, for example, are reopened again, there'll be more buses and more private cars, for example, on the road. And some say people will be shopping maybe further afield, do bigger shopping, some non-essential shops that reopened, for example, that opened last autumn, so there more traffic. So it'd be good to have that understanding. And also just another one, I'm not sure the London Fire Brigade has this. I know that I think Surrey has this. that those who volunteer or possibly work for, as part of the fire crew, in order to be on call out, if they're at home, they have to be within a certain time frame of the station. So I don't know how the London Fire Brigade work on that. I just know about Surrey. In this,
Okay.
I've got a firefighter friend there.
No, I understand that. I'll go with that question first because it's fresh in mind. London, that's I think you're referring to what's called retained firefighters. So there's a retained service. London Fire Brigade do not operate that. So we have fully crewed fire appliances 24/7. In theory, operating at stations, but that sort of lead. So we don't do the retained process.
Okay.
But it leads on to the question. I think it's about sort of operating model. Yes, notionally, appliances are located at stations, but we operate on a geographic mobilising system. So closest appliances go, and that's on a mapping basis sort of picked by our control systems. So so it's not. I can't always say where the fire appliance that is attending an incident will be or where it will be coming from. Does that make sense? That operating model. I don't. Target. Yeah, so I don't have the specific data for specific say incident in a specific an incident call to a specific location. I will be able to pick that individual data at a time, but I don't have an overall data in terms of statistical analysis. What I can say overall though, is I don't have the figures for last year, but I do know that attendance times have come down. In regards to busy roads and traffic, we operate in London, and London's roads are an ever-changing environment. This isn't necessarily new in the constructs of how we deal with that, as you'll appreciate from roadworks through to lots of other different changes. All I can say is we do have extremely well and highly trained fire appliance drivers on blue lights and sirens, and very much in essence that's how we make progress through traffic.
Yeah, it's a skill. I appreciate that.
Yeah, okay. So I'm extremely proud and eternally grateful because I have some fantastic people that work within the borough, and as I'm sure you all will be as well, that the service that the 164 firefighters within the borough provide, I'm extremely proud of. And there was one final bit. Is more about the specific averages within the statistics. Yeah, I don't have that data, but the numbers are an average, and there is a third criteria. Is any fire appliance anywhere in London within 12 minutes is our other criteria.
As in maximum.
Yeah, well, that's that's the standard targets pan London through our community risk management plan, or LSP 17. That's the standard that we set. So it's on average first appliance in 6 minutes, second appliance on average within 8 minutes, and a fire appliance within 12 minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think the borough's figures are clear, aren't they? So I think we can probably leave response times now. Councillor Driscoll.
Thanks. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the home fire safety visits.
Yes.
Just to say, Ben, I think you probably undersold the amount of value there is in these in some ways, and I can completely appreciate why they haven't hit their target this year, because for obvious reasons. But I mean, I attended a health scrutiny meeting where the fire service were doing a presentation on their home fire safety visits, but it wasn't just fire safety. They looked at, for older residents, the potential of falls and incidents of that nature. And they're often highlighting issues that were passed on to adult social care and other services that could then intervene and be a referral point. So obviously this year there's been several thousands not undertaken for a completely understandable reason. But going forward, is when we're out of lockdown, whenever that will be, and when we're back to some sort of normality, will the service try and shift priorities so that you can recoup some of those visits that haven't been undertaken? Is the capacity to try and go back in and put more time and resources into that option? And I'm thinking, obviously, because it's preventative work, and hopefully that investment in time and resources will pay dividends in less incidents of whatever nature in the future. So it'd be just interesting to see how you're managing going forward post the COVID era. Thank you.
Absolutely, yes. So currently we have as I mentioned before, we have a triage process, which is protection. Sorry, I apologise. I realise my camera hasn't been working. I don't know what it's doing now, but
you're a lovely kind of greeny yellow.
Yeah, yeah. So sorry, slightly sidetracked. So yes, we have a triage process, but we through our referral system, whether an individual or somebody on behalf of an individual, or indeed an agency phones up on behalf of an individual that may be requiring a home fire safety visit, or indeed going through data or going through our websites where you can request a home fire safety visit. It goes into our call centre and our community safety teams, and then we'll be triaged. And those that are not deemed as extremely high risk, or there may be COVID complications within that arena, we do keep the data, and that residents are spoken to or written to say that we will attempt to contact you as and when we can, as COVID regulations would allow. So yes, we will be going out to those. Your comment about the health scrutiny panel that you attended to previously, that was, I think you were referring to it was a pilot scheme we ran in Ealing. Running 5 boroughs across London a couple of years ago, called Fire Safe and Well, where we looked at other health activations and implications to prevent injury or worse from fire. And the information from that is included in our training and within our delivery of normal home fire safety visits now. The home fire safety visits are quite a large construct of our safeguarding work, where we will raise quite a few referrals through our safeguarding routes or concern routes into social services within council, and recommendations come out from that. And again, we have an excellent working relationship with the social network and informing and signposting people to those services and to those agencies, signposting to people that we may meet in our daily business. So yes, it is that was a very good pilot, and we still do entertain that. We still do use the information that's come out of that and learning that's come out of that. As I alluded to previously, within the borough, the highest risk individuals that present through accidental dwelling fires have the opportunity to, it's the wrong phrasing, not the opportunity, but are more likely to be injured or worse through fire, meet a particular demographic, which is over 65 that live alone, that do not have any smoke detection, and most likely have other health complications such as mobility or mental health issues and smoking. And all of those that combination of factors unfortunately leads to the greater chance of fire in the home. And we know from historic data that if you've had a home fire safety visit from us or other education processes and have smoke detection within the property and know what to do if that goes off, you are much less likely to A, have a fire, and B, be injured. And that's as a cornerstone of our community fire safety work anyway. Then we have the regulatory side of things, which is done by the regulatory fire safety departments and inspecting officers, it looks more at those are responsible under the regulatory reform order for ensuring the safety within the built environment for either a residence or escape routes or businesses and such like. And we do quite a lot of enforcement along those routes. So that was quite long-winded. Did that answer your question?
And so is there going to be the capacity to do some catch-up work in those sort of those wider safeguarding and other issues that you did mention that pilot is continued? So is there going to be some catch-up undertaken?
Well, yeah, it is our intention, yes, when we can, that we will be focusing on those as a priority. Those that have contacted us previously, yes, we will be attending to those. And you'll notice some figures in the times of less lockdown restrictions. You'll see peaks in the in our delivery. So, for example, October time, where the majority of those, so August, September, October, the majority of those were people that had been in contact for whatever reason hadn't, maybe COVID restrictions or hadn't quite tripped the triage process. But then we've gone back and recontacted and tried to deliver. But that is on the agenda for next year. Yes.
All right. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thanks, Ben. And the only question I had, kind of following on from kind of the consultation that we do around the LTNs, was consultation around buildings and planning. So a lot of questions come up at planning committees about the safety of proposals ahead of us, and where will people escape to, where will they congregate? And there's always there's fire brigade as a consultee on large developments. Is that something that you are involved in locally, or is that a central team? And how do you feel comfortable that the borough is allowing development that is safe and you're able to respond to should anything happen?
Okay, so it's not London Fire Brigade's responsibility to allow developments or not, if that makes sense. So I do get quite a lot of contact from members of the public and asking for them to sort of block various different schemes or persons' fence lines and various other things. And unfortunately, that doesn't suit me. That sits with planning departments. But under new developments and planning, there is we have a system that essentially goes through our consultation process through regulatory fire safety. So our central department teams and our fire safety regulations, and under the legal consultation, you have to consult with the fire services, and our fire safety teams will provide commentary, and that revolves around I've got to be honest, I don't know the actual term for it. All I know it is a D job, which I think is section D of the regulated form and planning applications, so that they are reviewed for fixed so firefighter installations and firefighter safety elements within a building, and all of those criteria. Fire hydrants, access, egress for fire appliances, and those elements. So that process does happen, yes, in terms of the consultation.
Great, thank you. Ben, I don't think there's anyone else there. So I think just, on behalf of us all, I mean, you mentioned some of the kind of parts of response that you'd done kind of outside of the kind of core fire safety work in terms of the COVID response. So thank you to you and your teams for pitching in and helping there when you've had slightly fewer things to do if people are staying at home more and things. So thank you, and for your ongoing work as well. So you're again more than happy to stay on as we rattle through the rest of the report. But if not, thank you very much for giving up your evening to join us.
Thank you. I'll try and sort my camera.
Thanks. So for the rest of us, there are another 74 pages of the report after the fire brigade part. I don't propose we go through everything in detail. I know Jess and Paul and the team have done a huge amount of work going into it, and I'm sure everyone has read the whole thing. So I think what we'll do, given it is just past 9 o'clock, if we go through each heading in turn, if there are any questions on that section, we'll take those, and we'll take the rest of it as read. And that's kind of not to understate the amount of work that's gone into it. So the next section is hate crime in Ealing. Did anyone want to raise anything under the hate crime section? No. Thank you. So domestic abuse. I think we've already kind of tackled somewhat earlier under the police section. Was there anything else on tackling domestic abuse and male violence against women and girls? I'm looking for hands up. Paul.
Yes, I mean it's part of because there's an awful lot of work going on with domestic abuse, the violence against women and girls, and it's about the communication of that. I mean, I had one thing about an online meeting. You can have a look at, for example, Ealing Extra and just see what's being offered there. And I think often the information we give out about these issues is about how to report it, but we don't actually report and publicize some of the outcomes. So we publicize how to report something, but not what the outcomes of these services are, which might be very difficult because of confidentiality and personal issues. But it's really for the officers on the call here, for Paul and Jess, about how do we promote that so people have the confidence about the services that we provide, and it's helpful for them to have confidence and know an example of what's to pursue and is offered. So it's how we communicate about those services, which I wanted to try and link in with.
Thanks. And Councillor Ball, and then we'll go to Jess and Paul for a response.
Yeah, I mean, obviously at the start of the first lockdown, there was a great deal of concern about people, victims getting stuck in situations where domestic abuse would get worse because they were, 24 hours a day with someone. How does the council assist people to find, to get out of those situations, to find safe spaces to move to, and have the numbers of people requiring to move for those reasons increased as was expected at the start of the situation?
Right, Jess, Paul, who wants to take those?
So yeah, if I ever go at the first one, Paul, and then perhaps you can talk about your comments on the first one and also cover some of the work we do around emergency accommodation. In terms of promoting some of the work, you're right, Councillor, it is very difficult to give quite personal kind of messaging and feedback in terms of what people's experiences are in that respect, because it is quite a sensitive thing. I mean, we do try and do some stuff around White Ribbon Day and things like that. There is work that goes on around trying to promote some of the work our Women Wellness Zone does as well, which is our kind of key, beyond funding, kind of independent third sector kind of organisations that do the independent domestic abuse advice service, which we provide and fund as a council. The Women's Wellness Zone is one of our key kind of approaches to trying to reduce risk around women, and that's looking at complex cases, so women with multiple complex needs trying to deliver services in a single location. So I think actually your point's a really good one, because there are some really good stories that come out of the work around the Women's Wellness Zone in particular, which is working with women who maybe have mental health, substance misuse and domestic abuse issues, or combinations of other quite complex and serious things. So it is something that I think we could try and do more of. Obviously, we are looking at our violence against women and girls strategy this year. We're due to refresh. That will also incorporate some stuff around women's safety, as well as the kind of more domestic abuse kind of work that we do. So that's quite a helpful suggestion for me to take back to the guys and talk about how we can kind of publicize some of the work we do. Obviously, the work that comes out of the report, as you'll see, kind of covers lots of different areas, and Paul and myself spend a lot of time talking to colleagues in comms, trying to get them to promote the work of all our various different teams. But the council does a lot of different things, and obviously they don't want to focus on one particular area. But you're right, it is very pro reporting, because the understanding is that domestic abuse is underreported, and so it is a real push where we try and encourage people to do that reporting, to allow services to try and capture those incidents and then help those women women and men out of those situations. But yeah, I think it is worth kind of doing some more work around presenting some of those stories in a positive light, to show what happens at the end of that, and what the value of that reporting is, and what the interventions that the council and third sector and police and other partners do to show people that there is a way out and another option, and actually it doesn't have to be that same way ongoing. You can get away from it and actually lead really fulfilling life and get away from that abusive behaviour. So I think that's a really good suggestion. I don't know whether, Paul, you want to add in to any of that and cover off the second part.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, I agree. It's a very good suggestion about increased communication. I think the communication that, and there's a real opportunity this year, I think, in the violence against women and girls strategy. And let's be honest, it's male violence against women and girls we're talking about. To actually start looking about male behaviour and how that feeds into how our communications message feeds into that as well. The fact that I think for the first time it feels like maybe we're actually on the verge of having a meaningful conversation about male attitudes and behaviours, and how talking about tackling perpetrators and talking openly about perpetrators considering their own conduct is actually really important too. There's a very interesting project that is relatively in its infancy in Ealing, but it is in place locally around men and masculinity, and it's a program that specifically targets male perpetrators of domestic abuse, and I think that those aspects of communications are actually taking, for example, stories, genuine sanitized stories of things that have happened, and not just for potential victims and survivors of domestic abuse to look at and see what options there are, but also recognize for perpetrators to recognize what their own behaviors are, and for I suppose people who are seeing those behaviors in their friends, challenging them and calling them out. In terms, Councillor Ball, of your particular question, I think about locally what options there are open and how those were maintained during COVID. I think obviously the report touches upon all of the various refuges that we work with, and the independent domestic violence advocate services that we work with, and how they maintain those services during COVID. In terms of providing safe pathways into refuge, we obviously, the 24-hour domestic violence hotline remained in place. Our duty desk here at Safe Communities remained in place throughout, and obviously the ECIRS, Ealing Children's Integrated Response Services, who obviously deal with the daily MASH, remained in place that time. So the pathways all stayed pretty much untouched. What was interesting, I thought, was we obviously, during the early days of the first lockdown, we were monitoring on a weekly basis. We would get a weekly report from police on exactly what the domestic abuse profile was for that week and how it compared with the same time the previous year, for us to try to get a running sense of was there a picture emerging, a similar picture that we'd seen happening elsewhere, which reassuringly there wasn't, although we started to see a general trend upwards, interestingly, more as lockdown was eased. So sort of around the July-August period, we actually saw more of an increase in reported domestic abuse. Also, I think there was just another quick point I had to make on that, sorry, and I rambled myself out of it. It's gone, apologies. There was something else I was going to say that I thought was quite important. If I remember it, I'll come back to it. But that's, yeah, sorry, that was not my best answer.
That's right, thank you.
The only other thing I might add, I suppose, is around our emergency housing function as well, operated in that capacity. So, you know, if people approach the council and could demonstrate they were in a domestic abuse situation, then our homelessness stuff would kick in. And obviously the council had a huge uplift in how they responded to homelessness, the use of hotels and other things as well. So there was also, in addition to the refuge stuff, the ability for us to put people via temporary accommodation into safe spaces as well, which I don't know whether that was what you were thinking of, Paul, but yeah, that's also, in addition to refuge, something the council offers to try and help people out of that space. So that also still currently, that's took place all through lockdown as well.
Great, thank you. We move on to the broader Safer Communities piece then, so the antisocial behaviour bits and so on. Are there any questions on the Safer Communities bit? I think the main thing to note is obviously the Mattock Lane safe zone has been reapproved for a second time round, and I know that was a huge piece of work from the team. Councillor Conlon and Councillor Shaw. I'm sure no coincidence that I mentioned Mattock Lane. Councillor Conlon.
Yes, hello, can you hear me, folks? Okay, yeah, well, it's not about Mattock Lane, so perhaps Councillor Shaw will ask about that, and not about LTNs either. But I was just wondering about the borough-wide PSPO, which has been in operation for, can't remember for exactly how long, but probably about 18 months or something now, has it? So we must have an idea how it's working. I just wondered how well that was working. Was it, helping to reduce antisocial behaviour? And are there any extra things that you think should be in there, or is it sort of covering everything that we wanted it to do?
Right, let's take Councillor Shaw as well, and then do the response.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Chair. I was just, first of all, thank you again for all the work on Matter Claim. Obviously, we went through it the first time, and it's great that we've managed to continue it. I mean, this is something that I think people really do support us with. It's worth highlighting just how significant it is. But also, I just wanted to ask on the sort of community safety. We did raise last year, I believe it was, there was some restructuring issues around some of the team, and I just wondered how you thought that's bedded in, Paul, if you can, that you were going to be sort of using other officers, who were coming available, and obviously a lot of it is in quite sort of labour intensive in terms of sort of the reporting and picking up all the details and so on in the safer communities team, especially sort of antisocial behaviour of neighbours, of people on streets and so on. So I just would sort of like to think how you think that's gone, and if there's any way that we could improve on it, or anything that you'd like help or more support, or even, I mean, dare I say, more resources. Not that the council doesn't really have any. We'd love more resources, but how you think that could go.
Sorry, let's just squeeze Councillor Driscoll in as well, and then that makes it an even 3, and we can keep moving. Sorry, Paul.
Yes, I've just flicked through my agenda, and I might have skipped too many pages, so I'll try and do it all from memory. But there's a table, I think it's table 18 from the top of my head, which has clusters of cases, and the highest one is drugs. And there's been quite an increase from previous years to this year. I mean, it doesn't take much to walk around certain parts of Ealing and just to smell marijuana being smoking in parks, on streets. And I know there's been cases of farms in houses that have been raided by the police and closed down. But I'm just wondering, what is the detail of that drugs issue, and how has it changed and increased, and essentially what we're doing about it. I don't know whether police officers might want to come in here as well, but just that prevalence on the street is very, very noticeable and very often. So just getting some comments about that would be really helpful.
Right. Yeah, Peter, do you want to pick that up first, and then we can go to Paul and Jess?
Yeah, certainly. So what we've launched on West there is a drug focus test, which has actually been so successful, it's now replicated across the entire organisation. So the key thing is the association between drugs and street level violence, which we know a lot of it is perpetrated by drug dealer on drug dealer. So we have had more of a focus on drugs through the drugs focus desk in terms of seeking prosecutions for supply where appropriate, as opposed to just simple possession, to try and actually get the people who are supplying the drugs rather than those that are purely taking it and smoking it. We have seen an increase in the issuance of cannabis warnings also. So it is a focus of ours, primarily due to the link in violence, as well as obviously it is, cannabis certainly can, depending on which side of the sort of analysis you look at, can be a gateway drug. So it's an area of focus, and that has been seen in terms of the increase in incidents, because it's police-generated activity. It's us going out to stop people as opposed to victims coming forward per se.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Jess. Paul, do you want to pick up?
Sure. Yeah, I think maybe if I pick up the questions in the order that they were asked as best I can, and then maybe Jess, if you want to jump in with things that I'm sure I'll miss, and anything additional you want to add. In terms of, I think Councillor Connon, you asked a question about the borough-wide PSPO, which was introduced back in around. Crikey, it was July 2019, wasn't it? So it is actually coming up it'll be 2 years this summer. So we will be having to look as to whether or not we're going to renew that going into summer 2022. The order obviously primarily covers, I guess, there's 4 key areas, one being the borough as a whole, to which there are some straightforward, very, very basic conditions, but hopefully conditions that appear to be quite helpful for police when they're engaging with people, particularly around providing your name if you are asked, and stuff related to street drinking and psychoactive substances. It's effectively an extension of what was the old school controlled drinking zone for the borough as a whole. It also covers the other 3 key areas of all of our town centres, all of our housing estates, and all of our parks and open spaces. You've probably seen on your travels about the borough the signs, which are quite they're quite across the board now in all of the key areas. In terms of the majority of our signs are now in place. There was a final push recently around borough-wide PSPO signs around schools, particularly thinking about coming back out of lockdown to deal with issues that you might have in the surrounding areas of schools as a sort of enhanced measure. And I suppose the key thing to reiterate in terms of how it's working, we did undertake a review 6 months in, and there was a report done, I believe, to went to SLT at the time, and we did another report that we delivered last year in autumn, which was sort of the 1 year period that was delivered at the Safe Reading Partnership, which looked specifically around numbers of fixed penalty notices that were being issued, because obviously the primary tool that police will use when they're enforcing the PSPO is dispersal. It's generally a way of moving people on using a realistic and balanced approach. There will be times when they think it's appropriate to issue somebody with a fixed penalty notice. That will normally be after either a reasonable request to disperse has been issued, or if the person is doing something that's quite an aggravated breach of the PSPO. We've only issued in the round, I'd have to broad brush say this, it's probably fewer than 200 FPNs have been issued since the PSPO was introduced. That's obviously brought in what you could say is a very small amount of revenue. All of those fines are payable to the council, so they come to us. We have prosecuted a number of non-payers of FPNs as well, and that process is now quite well bedded in. That was quite a tricky thing to implement because it's the first time that we were routinely prosecuting a borough-wide PSPO. But using the lessons that we learned from the previous PSPOs that we implemented, West Ealing, Southall, and other areas, we were sort of able to develop this process. I think it's working pretty well. I think it works best when we communicate best about what it is to people, and I think councillors have been really helpful in reiterating that on a local level. I think the police through their ward panels have been very good about reiterating that at the safer neighbourhood teams level. And we do tend to get we get very little negative feedback about the PSPO. Sometimes there'll be a complaint that people aren't seeing enough signs, or that they feel that it's not being appropriately enforced. A very common complaint we got in the early days would people say, I saw somebody breaching the PSPO, I called the police and they said they wouldn't attend. And we are trying to get that message. We don't ask people to call the police when they see a breach of the PSPO. That's not why you would call the police. The PSPO is there as an extra tool for police and partners to use to help us try to nudge behaviours in the right direction, improve and enhance those sort of public spaces. We have looked around disproportionality around FPNs as well. There's certainly a higher number, although not concerningly high, but a higher number being issued around against young people. We obviously want to drill down further into that and make sure that there isn't a disproportionality, for example, around BAME communities or any particularly vulnerable groups. At this point, the data doesn't seem to support that we are disproportionately targeting groups like that, but we will be keeping a very close eye on that. And obviously, before any decision is taken to renew the PSPO in 2022, we'd have another report that would go to the Safe Reading Partnership and probably be brought back, in fact, to this scrutiny panel next year would make a lot of sense as well. So that's probably a note for ourselves to include that in as a part of our next year scrutiny report. To come on to Councillor Shaw's question, you asked about changes in structure within the Safe Communities team. I might need to ask you just to clarify a couple of bits on your question, but I think that the key part that you might be referring to is last year how we were talking about the changes within the noise and nuisance team. So bringing a dedicated noise and nuisance officer into the cluster model. That has now happened, and also the use of our housing hubs as well. So housing officers who will inherently have a bit more of an ASB reporting function, because they are very much eyes and ears. They're based in 6 regional housing hubs. They get a much better idea about what is going on locally. Obviously, COVID has somewhat impacted how that works on a local level with the level of working from home that we're doing. But I would anticipate going into summer, a lot of those housing hubs are going to continue to be pretty key in that regard. What I would certainly say is there have been some recent examples of really good practice there, where you've got housing officers who are not just reporting concerns through to us, but actually at some points taking a statement, raising a safeguarding concern before it even comes to us. So some of the work has already been done in that regard. We've also got the Ealing Community Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference, the EC MARIC as well, and the 2 temporarily funded posts that are linked to that, which is an enforcement and an intervention officer. There have been some staffing changes around that. We lost a really good member of the team who has gone on to become a very good role social worker in Richmond, but we'll be recruiting to that role in the coming month or 2. But those officers do provide a lot of extra value. Obviously, as I say, they're funded temporarily by MOPAC, and they are there as a specific support role for the MARIC. But with any additional skill set they have, having that co-located in the team is really useful. It's also fair to say that Ealing has continued to benefit from having co-located police officers. We feel very fortunate in that regard. It's not something necessarily that Hounslow or Hillingdon enjoy, and it's something that has been really useful for us. I know those police officers absolutely work for Hounslow and Hillingdon as well, but having that local connected relationship with them, and they physically are here in the building with us, were here with us today, that's really helpful and invaluable too. Councillor Short, if I have missed anything on that question, please do let me know after I wrap this up as well. I'm happy to come back to it. Finally, I took a note down because I said when I was listening, I'm afraid to Councillor Driscoll, your question was specifically in regard to the cluster split, I think, wasn't it? In terms of, you mentioned specifically figure 18 and the split in terms of the balance of workload. Yes. Could I just ask you to repeat your question? I'm really sorry, I didn't write it down.
I was trying to do, because I'd skipped the pages in my document pack, so I was struggling to find them. Just looking at the increase in drugs as part of that work, so it's at the top of the table, and also it's increased quite substantially.
Yes, no, absolutely, and I know that's right. This is the question that Mr. Gardner, I know, answered to some extent as well. I think it's fair to say that when it comes to the challenges that we face locally, drugs, as in the supply of drugs, and the impact, the knock-on impact that has in terms of obviously acquisitive crime, but arguably more concerningly, the knock-on impact that can have on violent offences and the exploitation of young people, the exploitation of vulnerable adults. I do think it is one of the nationally one of the biggest issues we face, and it's certainly locally one of the biggest issues we face. And there's probably a whole wider debate we could have around the appropriateness of the current drugs laws that we have, both the United Kingdom and far beyond. But yeah, we see it pretty much year on year that drugs will increase in terms of those are concerns, that there's a drugs element to a concern that people are raising with us, and it can be something as simple as smelling cannabis. Obviously, I think cannabis as a smell is something people have become more attuned to. One thing we have definitely seen an increase in this year is the people that have just called up saying they can smell their neighbours who are smoking cannabis, and often I think that comes from not necessarily realising that your neighbour might have had a bit of a habit and smokes cannabis at home during the daytime, and then people who are stuck at home, it bothers them more. That said, cannabis is still illegal. smoking cannabis in your home is still illegal. It's just a very difficult offence to deal with in any sort of meaningful way, and the police are somewhat limited in their powers around that. Obviously, when it's properties that we manage, we take drug use and certainly drug supply extremely seriously, and that's evidenced in the increase that you'll see in the number of notices seeking possession this year. I would say there's probably a drug supply element to at least 50, if not 60-70% of the notices seeking possession that we served against tenants of the local authority, and those will be in situations where there is a clear drug supply issue that has happened, which has been evidenced. But yeah, drug use and drug supply is something that is very much at the forefront of people's concerns when they're speaking with our team.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. It is 9:30, and I'm conscious that we've got a lot of the report that we've not kind of talked about or asked questions on, but it is, as I said, 9:30, and I know if anyone, people are stuck on these things all day. We don't want to be stuck on them even longer. So let's quickly rattle through. I mean, does anyone have any burning questions they want to ask on the rest of the report? And there is a huge amount of detail in there, and there's certainly things that I want to kind of know, but I'll pick up separately. Like, why are park guards spending 600 hours patrolling somewhere that's not even in the borough on our contract? But I'm sure I can ask that separately. Councillor Rice.
Thank you, Chair. There's one thing in the regulatory services parts where it talks about the roadmap, and just looking at how we're going to deal with hospitality and when matters open up a bit more. But that does make me start to think about how we're going to also deal with things on a more domestic scale. For example, you're going to have perhaps the possibility of lots of people having garden parties and creating a lot of noise and disturbance, and how we prepare for that. Because I know certainly over the summer, when I was complaining about noise issues on behalf of the residents, I would just find that the officers I was speaking to on the phone were actually just quite overwhelmed because they were getting so many hundreds of extra complaints. And it makes me wonder just if we're actually going to be ready to deal with another onslaught of that. Thank you.
Yeah, I know Peter touched on that earlier when he talked about the 4E, the 4E, 3E approach, 4Es. 4, good. I was listening. I got it right the first time. So I don't know if there's anything, Paul and Jess, you want to add from the council's side.
So if I quickly just talk about the regulatory aspect, I suppose we are in conversation with Peter's guys around how we take that forward, because obviously as Peter outlined, it's going to be really concerning around how people choose to unlock. There is a lot of pent up frustration. I mean, we all feel it in terms of particularly between now and potentially the 12th of April, when, the 29th, we see people able not to, the advice to stay at home ends, but there's not necessarily going to be places to go until the 12th of April. So the parks are going to be the first kind of space. I'm reporting back to Gold tomorrow about some of the work that we're doing with the police, our park guard patrols, also our COVID steward work as well, and how we're deploying that resource between now and the 12th of April. Similarly, we're having a conversation with the police about the 12th of April, because our stewards, and particularly my environmental health officers who are in the report, will have to take on a lot of additional work around things like the non-hospitality stuff. So not the pubs, but necessarily things like hairdressers, your nail bars, all these things that are going to open up now. And Joe's guys are going to have to be out there supporting them to kind of do so safely. You're going to see queuing in relation to some businesses and things like that. The police and my guys will have to share the kind of work around some of the pubs and the use of pub gardens, which will also create potential noise issues, as you've outlined, Councillor Rice, in terms of pubs will want to make some money now. They've obviously, their backs are against the wall, so they will be maximising that outdoor space to try and, both, cater to the demand, but also try and start to, deal with some of the financial pressures that they're experiencing, which all other businesses will. So I anticipate it's going to be a real challenge, and then that will of course fall into the noise space. Paul's noise patrol has seen a massive uptick over last year and summer in terms of demand, and some of that is around people using their outdoor space, but also people being at home more and not being at work and being disturbed and trying to work at home, people managing children and young people at home, people trying to do building works. And I mean, I had it here myself, neighbors doing building works and trying to do calls and all that kind of stuff. It creates a lot of tension and pressure. So it's going to be a challenge. I mean, we have our resource and we are well organized, and we have moved to the new patrolling and commission service around noise, and that happened through the winter specifically so we would be ready and prepared in the summer period when we're much more busy to work the kinks out in the quiet time, so that we're a little bit more prepared in the summertime to take that on. But I'm not going to lie to you, it's going to be a really intense time between now and kind of the end of September, and we're going to be stretched. So I'm having a conversation about whether we can repurpose some funding around some of the high street stuff that they're now taking on some of the COVID steward, and whether we can squeeze an extra parks team in for the summer to try and maximize the resource. So we're going to pull every trick up our sleeve to try and make sure that we've got boots on the ground to deal with that. But I expect it to be a challenge, and I expect you guys to also similarly, like we did last summer, have residents, because you will have one end of the spectrum, which is people wanting to let down their hair, and people who are less inclined to be concerned about COVID, who now finally want to have some fun. But then similarly, you'll get the other end where people are still quite concerned about the virus and want to see those kind of controlled unlocking. So it's trying to marry up those two very different perspectives and try and keep people safe. So it is going to be a challenge. I'll hand over to you, Paul. I know you wanted to say something.
No, I think absolutely. I think Councillor Rice, when you said about what the residential space and what's going to be happening during this summer, and I think the difference between, and it's concerns like that probably give me some of the most sleepless nights of this. But I think it's fair to say that last summer it was quite different in the sense that we were not doing, for example, home visits, in the sense we weren't going into people's homes. As lockdown is easing this time, we're starting to do more and more of that. So we're doing indoor inspections more often than we would have been doing under certain risk assessed conditions. And moving into summer, as restrictions are lifted entirely, particularly in regards to indoor mixing, we will be lifting that restriction entirely, which does give us a bit of an extra tool to use. What it does mean is that we'll be very stretched, because I think it's fair to say that last summer we were fortunate in the sense that because we physically couldn't go into people's homes, we were only witnessing from street level, there was arguably an expectation from residents. And funnily enough, that reduction in expectation for the majority of the time actually I think worked in everybody's favour, because residents understood that we were living through quite extraordinary times, but also people were behaving themselves more, I suppose, than they might do this summer. And I think there is a concern that this summer people are going to, it's going to be a bit of a summer of celebration, which could work in our favour in the sense that people are more understanding and accepting. But we also know that there's a lot of residents that, particularly if they're working from home, really do feel that they've lost their home as their sanctuary if they can't get any peace there during the daytime and they're working and they go to bed and there's a party going on in either of the back gardens on both sides. That can become very demoralising and actually quite damaging to your health overall as well. So we will be taking those calls very seriously, and we'll be doing our best to reassure people. We did find last summer that the reassurance was extremely helpful. Just people knowing that there was somebody who would answer the phone and you could have a conversation with, even sometimes about some sort of basic things that could be followed up the following day, was seen as a helpful tool. What I would say about the contracted service as well is the fact that they do have body-worn video that they're using now, which has made capturing the exact detail of what's going on and then actioning it the following day even easier. And we do have enough flexibility built into the current model that when you've got really busy or anticipated busy, hot weekends where we run the party patrol service, we can potentially increase our service to double capacity just for those weekends. It will be at the expense of other times of the year, but actually that's quite a smart way to work it. We saw periods, for example, Tuesday evenings during December where there wouldn't be a phone call to the service. And there's simply no point having a service running on those occasions. So it's about balancing it and working out our plan, which also includes the parks, as Jess said, and that's going to be a very key area of focus, more so in the early half, I think, in that little spot you've got between we haven't quite got hospitality open. We certainly haven't got indoor hospitality open. The pub gardens, when they do open, are going to be full and booked in advance. The parks are going to be where I think some of our concerns around antisocial behaviour, particularly people who stick around after hours, is going to be. So yeah, those are the key areas.
Great, thanks, Paul, and thanks, Jess. I think we'll draw it to close there, because I think there is far more in the report than we could ever get through in an evening. And I think these crime and disorder committees always do run on quite late, but it's no reflection that we're not interested in the rest of the report. It is fantastic to see the amount of work in there, and there's a lot in there in terms of the COVID response, and the trading standards on kind of the quality of PPE being kind of sold as well, but also all the ongoing stuff that your teams haven't stopped doing in the last year. So thank you both very much for the very comprehensive report and the work your team do. And Peter, and to Ben, who I think's dropped off, thank you again to the Met and the Fire Brigade and our other partners for their work. That is the only item on our agenda this evening. So our next meeting is the 8th of April. We do have a call-in, you'll be excited to know, on the cycle schemes, the COVID emergency cycle schemes. We also have an update on the workplace equalities report that we've been waiting for some time, and we'll be agreeing our topics for the scrutiny panels in the next year. Thank you all very much for your time this evening, and I will see most of you on the 8th of April.